A true autobiography of my life as a prisoner of war from 15th February 1942 until 12 September 1944. Author J.W. Turner. Narrated by Will Stoff. Before starting my story as a POW, perhaps the reader would like to read a brief outline of my activities prior to the capitulation of Singapore. I enlisted in the AIF after having spent 4 years in the 10th Battalion Militia. Within 10 days of enlisting, I was drafted to Alice Springs as a transport driver in the DOMF, Darwin Overland Maintenance Force. I spent 3 months convoying food supplies, a distance of 700 miles each way to Burma and back to Alice Springs. I was rather lucky on this job, as I turned a 3-ton Maple Leaf Chevrolet truck upside down and had my driver's license suspended until a court of inquiry could be held. Whilst I was waiting for this court of inquiry, I was offered 3 stripes in charge of an Army canteen at Newcastle Waters, about 400 miles north of Alice Springs, which I accepted. I remained on this job until about 14th January, when volunteers for a motor transport unit were called for to immediately go overseas. I jumped at this opportunity to get away, not only from the monotonous life of the Northern Territory, but also to go overseas. I was one of 134 men in my unit, detachment, 2nd Reserve Motor Transport Koi, and after spending 4.5 days embarkation leave at my home in Adelaide, I was sent to Melbourne, where we remained for 1 week. On the 1st February 1941, we left by troop train for Sydney, arriving at the wharf at 7 a.m. to be taken by ferries about 1.5 miles across to the Queen Mary, arriving at Singapore on 17th February 1941 after an uneventful voyage from Sydney to Fremantle, across the Indian Ocean to Singapore. We were enthusiastically welcomed by natives of nationalities and English officers from Malaya Command. During the 10 months prior to the outbreak of war with Japan, we saw and did many things. The type of work we did was mainly transporting infantry battalions on maneuvers and unloading ammunition and food ships that came into Singapore Harbor. We had not been in this country more than 3 months before we were heartily fed up and sick of it, and wishing we were sent home or to the Middle East. Being sent to Malaya and not to the Middle East was always a sore point with the 8th Division. Before the war with Japan, the native population of Malaya and Singapore had listened to too much propaganda by the Japanese and really believed they would have a wonderful time if the Japanese could root the British out of these countries. Consequently, when the Japanese entered the war, many of those easy to convince gave every assistance to the Japanese in leading them through the jungle and hampering the British in their efforts to hold the Japanese on their southward drive. I could give many instances of fifth column activities, but will only give one typical instance treachery. A dancing cabaret for the soldiers was always well attended by the troops in a town called Malacca on the west coast of Malaya. This dancing cabaret was under the management of what we believed was a Chinaman. This Chinaman was very good to the boys, filling them up with beer and whiskey, and then casually inquiring of their movements and finding out the men's individual units. We all thought he was a great scout. About 3 weeks after the capitulation, this so-called Chinaman turned up at our POW camp in the uniform of the Japanese Army and wearing the rank of a Japanese major. This instance alone should give the reader some idea of the magnitude of the fifth column activities in these countries. As a guess, I would estimate well over 50% of the natives of Singapore and Malaya, excluding the Chinese, assisted the Japanese in one way or another. Hostilities with Japan commenced on the 5th December 1941. We lived a hectic life dodging Japanese bombs, bullets and shells in our retreat down to the Malaya Peninsula, to the 22-square-mile island of Singapore. It is now with pleasure I am able to voice not only my opinion, but the opinion of the whole 8th Division on the soldier in charge of the Australians in Malaya and Singapore, Lieutenant General Gordon Bennett. In my opinion, we could not have wished for a better general, a man who understood the feelings of his men and led them with courage and confidence into the battle as he did. Lieutenant General Bennett escaped from Singapore after he had done his job and Singapore had capitulated, and not before. Had he remained with his men, he could have done nothing for them, because 3 months after the capitulation, all officers above the rank of colonel were taken either to Japan or Formosa. Also, with the knowledge of Japanese tactics in jungle warfare, it was General Bennett's duty to Australia and its people to get home and to pass on the valuable information he had. In concluding, I sincerely hope this has some effect on the people who have had bitter thoughts and harsh words for a great general. If the Aussies have the honor of retaking Singapore, no one would be more welcomed by the 8th Division than Lieutenant General Gordon Bennett, in charge of an Aussie division. February 15th, 1942. This was a black day for we defenders of Singapore. We were being continually shelled by artillery and mortars, and bombed by low-flying twin-engine bombers. Our 3.7 ACAC guns were particularly useless, as their rangefinders had been smashed by Japanese bombers, and our Air Force wasn't there. They had left for Java. How we lived through that day was a miracle to all of us. At approximately 8 p.m., we were informed by our OC that Singapore had fallen, and we were now POW. All firing had ceased. Imagine the continuous roar of planes overhead, the crashing of bombs and the explosion of shells, the whining of machine gun bullets all day long for days and nights past, and suddenly a deadly silence everywhere. It took days before we really realized it had finished and that we were POWs. I slept like a log this night. I might add all units in Singapore except hospital staff were turned into infantry groups about 3 days before we capitulated. February 16, 1942. We marched to Tanglan Barracks to hand over to the Japs all equipment and arms, and were informed by our OC that the Japanese artillery had their guns trained on us and would open fire on the Tanglan Barracks if anyone attempted to escape. At 3 p.m., we began a nightmare march to Changi Camp, 15 miles north of Singapore. The reaction of the last few days had set in, and men were weak from lack of sleep and food. I had eaten practically nothing during the last few days. The thought of food made me want to vomit. 15,000 Australians marched to Changi. Many men fell out on the roadside to sleep as night came on. I arrived in Changi at 3 a.m. on the 17th February. February 17, 1942 to May 15, 1942. 1. Estimated native and civilian casualties on Singapore Island by the Japs was 50,000. Estimated Japanese casualties was 96,000, and estimated Australian casualties was approximately 3,500 during the action of Malaya and Singapore. 2. I managed to take about 200 cigarettes to Changi with me, but these did not last long. We were given by the Japs for about 4 weeks, 10 cigarettes per man per week. Many men resorted to smoking dried-out pawpaw leaves and hibiscus hedge leaves, which was not very tasty or satisfying. 3. We lived on European food, short rations, for about 2 weeks. Then came the never-to-be-forgotten rice. We were informed we were going on a rice diet. I had visions of boiled rice, milk, and sugar, as I had at home, and was always fond of. Imagine my disappointment when we were given plain rice. Cooking facilities were very poor, and our rice was cooked in big coppers, which was the reason for our rice being very gluey. Green pawpaws cut up and boiled, and hibiscus hedge leaves was our stew 5 days out of 7. And the other 2 days we were issued a 12-ounce tin of bully beef to be divided between a dozen men, about a teaspoon of meat per man. The cooks did their best to make the meals tasty by grinding coconuts, which we scrounged in the area, and making sweet rice rissoles by putting into clay ovens, which we made. Many men starved for days before they could settle down to this monotonous diet. There was an active shortage of salt, and lack of salt in their bodies caused many men to have dizzy turns and blackouts. It was not unusual for men to go for 10 to 15 days without going to the latrine except to urinate, which was anything up to 20 times a night. Rice containing so much water. 4. Over the wire. We had the job of fending for ourselves in the Changi POW camp with barbed wire and seek Indian Guards, who stand on an average of about 6'3", wearing turbans on their head and have a black beard. They patrolled outside the wire to see no one escaped. These Indians volunteered to the Japs for this job and carried a British .303 rifle and bayonet. But there were ways and means of getting away from camp by crawling underneath a culvert running over the main road and coming out into a rubber plantation on the opposite side. The reason for going out was to buy tins of meat, milk, sardines, cigarettes, and coconuts from the profit-making civilian natives who stole food from former British food dumps on the island. I went out many times on behalf of my section of 15 men who put all their money in a common pool. Here are a few of the prices we paid for such commodities as mentioned. Milk, 12 shillings a tin. Sardines, 9 shillings tin. Bully beef, 9 shillings a tin. Cigarettes, 3 shillings packet 10. Coconuts, 1/6 divided each. Needless to say, we soon ran out of money and had to be satisfied with the rice again. Many men who went through the wire brought back such goods to the camp and resold the goods, making about 50% profit on each article. This was called Paddy's Market. There was an element of risk of being caught outside the wire and being shot, which made the majority of men hesitate about going out and therefore having to buy from Paddy's Market. 5. Murder of Chinese. A gruesome job of work many of our men were forced to do by the Japs was to bury hundreds of unfortunate Chinese families in the sand of Changi Beach. These Chinese, for no reason other than an ingrained hatred for the Japs, were lined up on the beach with wives and even children, stripped of all valuables and shot to death by Bren guns. Large holes were dug at intervals on the beach, and as many as 100 Chinese were buried in each hole. I fortunately was never on one of these burial parties. 6. Work and leisure time. We had much to occupy our minds the first 3 months as POW. Lectures of farming, drawing, education, languages, etc. were organized, and concert parties were arranged. I took part in these concerts as a female impersonator. Nurses' clothing, rouge, face powder, lipstick, and creams were obtained from former Australian nurses' trunks, which were left on the island when they evacuated Singapore. Every one of them wanted to stay to the finish and look after the wounded, but they had no option but to leave, and thank goodness they did, as I dread to think of their treatment at the hands of the Japanese. 7. The first 3 months under the Japs, we saw very little of them. We were under the administration of our own divisional command. The Japs made us line up both sides of the roadway one day, while Japanese Navy and Army heads drove through inspecting the POWs. The Japanese filmed this occasion. The buildings we were in were formerly the living quarters of the permanent British Army stationed in Singapore. Many of these buildings were badly damaged during the action on the island, and quite a few had no roof. I was quartered on the second story of what had been a NAAFI canteen overlooking the entrance to the Singapore Naval Base. 8. During the first 3 months, we had an opportunity of seeing the strength of the Japanese Navy, as many dozens of aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, gunboats, corvettes, etc. came into Singapore Naval Base. 9. General optimism. The majority of we POWs were very optimistic about our position. We expected reasonable treatment, regular supplies of medicine, Red Cross parcels, and letters from home, but we were doomed to disappointment. Also, we were sure Singapore would be retaken any day. Many wirelesses were smuggled out to Changi, and about once a week we would get the news summary, but this news summary would go through many hands before we would receive it. Consequently, it was very much twisted and optimistic. E.g., American troops landed in Malaya and heading towards Singapore was one of the many stories we were told. 10. Sport. Several cricket matches were played between the British and Australian 11. The Aussies won all matches played whilst we were there. 11. In the Jemaolong Mersing district, where the Australians fought, the Japs could not locate the landmines which had been planted there. So detailed the number of men from the engineers to locate and delouse them. These men had no option but to do as they were ordered. 3 of our engineers were killed by shrapnel from landmines in this operation. 12. Work party. 3,000 Australians, along with British POWs, were detailed to build the road and level a hillside just off the Bukit Timor Road and build a monument in memory of the 96,000 Jap casualties on Singapore Island during the action. 13. Clothing. The only clothing I had when I arrived in Changi was the shorts, shirt, boots I stood up in, and a blanket. Many had no blanket. We slept on cement floors in the buildings we were in. 14. A laugh. One officer from the 6th Division Engineers, who had not done a very good job during the action, came to light at Changi, inflicting a lot of unnecessary punishments, such as pack drill on his men. He was rewarded in the early hours of one morning with a bucket of excrement thrown from the window on top of him. The culprit could not be found, but 4 men did 28 days in cell for this offense. 15. A farce. Early in the day, 3,000 men, including myself, were notified we would be leaving Singapore for an unknown destination. But it did not take long for a fantastic story to develop to the effect that we were to be exchanged for Jap POWs and would be going on a neutral ship to Portuguese Timor to be handed over to the Australian government. Men even swore they had seen 4 Portuguese ships come into the harbor and had seen Portuguese sailors in Singapore. Even many of our officers believed these stories. One story said we were to be exchanged for a bale of Australian wool for 1 Australian soldier. This is only 2 of the 100 yarns we heard and believed. Throughout the 2 years, 7 months that I was a POW, it was believing in these stories and constantly expecting the war to finish within 3 months that kept our spirits up and pulled us through the tough times, which you will hear about later. Shortly after we left Singapore, 3 men from my unit attempted to escape from Singapore. They had stocked up with tins of meat and fish, which they had bought from the natives in Singapore. They also had a prismatic compass, which they had smuggled out of Changi. Their intentions were to cross the half-mile strip of water dividing Singapore from Malaya, making it to Port Dickson, 250 miles north of Singapore, steal a native sampan boat, and make for Java or Sumatra, not knowing that Java and Sumatra at that time were in Japanese hands. Unfortunately, they were caught before they left the island and were flogged and starved for a week before being sentenced to 15 years hard labor in the Changi jail. That was the last we heard of them. 16. Indian soldiers' treatment. Many thousands of Indian soldiers were also taken prisoner on Singapore Island. These Indians were put in an area, fenced in, and starved for a week. No food or water. At the end of the week, the Japanese made them an offer which they had no alternative but to take. Either starve to death or join the Japanese Army of Indian National Army for the liberation of the Indians in India from the British. Many hundreds of Indians were true to the colors of the red, white, and blue and refused. The Japs were not daunted. They started on their tortures, chopping off a finger a day off Indian soldiers, forcing water into their stomachs until they stretched to about 3 times their normal size, putting red-hot needles under their fingernails, and many other such punishments. Eventually, they tired of this pleasure as there was no response from these few hundred Indians who loved and were true to the British. These men are to be admired for what they went through and did not join up with the Japs. The Indians who did join up with the Japs were made transport drivers mainly, but their heart was not on the job. They slipped us cigarettes and food whenever the opportunity arose. Also, they gave us many news items they had heard. When the time comes for the retaking of Singapore, these Indians will give the British all the aid possible. V for victory. Signs are to be seen everywhere on the Singapore Island. If the Japs see this, they bash hell out of the natives. 17. Departure. Eventually, the 15th May came around, and we were driven to Singapore Keppel Harbor to board not neutral ships, but 2 Japanese cargo ships for an unknown destination. May 15th, 1942 to August 6th, 1942. 1. Ship life. We worked till midnight on the 15th of May, loading our ship, Rakayo Maru, with supplies. Needless to say, we managed to fill our pockets with sugar we scrounged, and if we were lucky, such as I was, scrounge a couple of tins of Heinz Irish stew, which tasted marvelous. To give the reader an idea of how we were packed in the cargo hold of the ship, 2 square meters was allotted for 12 men. 1,319 men were allotted 328,000 square feet. The heat was horrific, even though it rained on top of us day after day. Many men had dysentery, and many were seasick, making conditions shocking. Those who still had watches sold them to the Jap sailors for 5 packets of cigarettes. We sailed in the early hours of the morning of the 16th of May, where we anchored for a day outside of Medan in Sumatra, where we picked up more vessels containing Dutch POWs from Sumatra. We arrived at Victoria Point on the 22nd of May, and 1,000 men under command of Major Green and Major Cameron, 2nd Machine Gun Battalion, went ashore about a 7-mile trip in motor barges to the mainland. Victoria Point is the most southerly point of Burma. The remaining 3,000 POWs went on, 1,000 stopping at Mergui, where they reconstructed an aerodrome, 1,000 to Tavoy, Lower Burma, where they also repaired a damaged aerodrome and built new landing and takeoff strips. There was only a very small fishing village at Victoria Point, with a small population consisting of Indians, Burmese, Malay, and a sprinkling of Chinese. All the civilian white population had been put to death by the Japanese, except the Air Force, who had abandoned the place before the Japanese arrival. 2. Housing conditions. 700 men under command of Major Green marched 7 miles to the aerodrome and were quartered mainly in one large, leaky shed which led the rain through. The remaining 300, of which I was one, were quartered in one-room houses which had once belonged to Indian police, who had been killed by the Japanese. 3. Lecture. The morning after we arrived, the Japanese captain in charge of us read out a screed in Japanese, which was interpreted by a Japanese private in very good pidgin English. The text of the speech was as follows: "You work hard, and we will give you much." This was repeated many times. "You must never escape. If you escape, you will be shot. You must always speak the truth. You must always salute all Japanese soldiers. If you have no hat on, you must bow. If you do not salute, you will be severely punished. You must not speak to natives." 4. Nicknames. It was not long before we had nicknames for most of the Japanese. They were soldiers who had fought in Malaya and Java: Fish Face, Fan Face, Rat Face, Happy, Boofhead. 5. Work. The 700 men who went to the aerodrome reconstructed the buildings and land as they had been badly damaged, and also enlarged same. We 300 in the village repaired a road 7 miles long to the aerodrome and unloaded ships that brought in supplies of food, petrol, etc. The work was not very hard, and we never worked in the rain. 6. Treatment. On looking back over my 2 years, 7 months POW days, we were reasonably well treated at Victoria Point. These Japs had been frontline soldiers and gave us a fair go, although at the time we thought we were treated roughly. Of course, there were those who delighted in making things hard for us. Lieutenant Shirazi, who was in charge of us, was well educated and owned the Nisun Engineering Works in Tokyo. He realized that Japan could not win the war. He was one of the few who did realize that. His word was law, but he was also fair and gave orders to our guards that there were to be no bashing, but there was still a certain amount of bashing done on the quiet. 7. Cruelty. The Japanese are the most cruelest people I have ever seen. Here is an example of their cruelty. For no reason at all, I saw a Japanese cook catch a dog, soak it in petrol, and set fire to it. Also, a pet monkey bit a Japanese soldier on the finger, and the Japanese picked up the monkey by the tail and swung it around his head and smashed the monkey on the ground. This was done many times before he calmed down. Then he petted the monkey. They have peculiar natures. They will bash you, then give you a cigarette. It was worth a bashing if you could be sure of getting a smoke. 8. The Japs are very childish. Once a month we would have a big parade, and presents would be handed out to the best workers amongst us for the month. A tin of milk, a packet of cigarettes, a tin of fish, and even a roll of toilet paper, which was a thing of the past. Green leaves were the substitute. The gift of toilet paper was used as cigarette paper. 9. Nightly escapades. My best friend, Jack Williams, of Millicent, South Australia, and I nightly sneaked down to the village and very soon made fast friends with a Chinese called Asun and his brother Asi, a Thailand gardener, and a Burmese who had an interest in a Burmese gold mine. These people gave us cigars, bananas, breadfruit, pawpaws, and cups of coffee. They were wonderfully good to us and hated the Japs who looted their shops and raped their women. They were also very frightened of the Japanese. Jack and I had many narrow escapes from being caught. We stole petrol from the Japs and sold it to the natives for their petrol lamps, getting 10 rupees for a 4-gallon tin. Jack was unfortunately believed to have drowned when we were torpedoed in September 1944. 10. News. We received many interesting news items of war affairs from the natives, and Major Cameron was given a small wireless set which could pick up New Delhi in India. 11. Deaths. We only had 3 deaths out of 1,000 men for the 3 months at Victoria Point. One of the 3 deaths was caused through a man attempting to escape. He was caught and shot 4 days after his attempted break. It was useless attempting to escape as we were surrounded by sea, mountain, and jungle. 12. Australia falls. We were informed by the Japs that Australia had fallen and that Japanese soldiers had our wives and sweethearts. We never could believe it, though. They were always boasting about what they had and why they were bombing. And what they were bombing. We used to ask them, Luna Park, bomb? They would say, Luna Park, bomb. Then we would ask them if such places as Shirley Temple, Dina Durbin, Charlie Chaplin were being bombed, and they would always reply, yes. 13. Concerts. Concerts were held regularly. We had a violin which was later sold for food, a clarinet and a guitar, plus our female attire which we had bought from Singapore. I took part in those concerts. 11. Scrounging. Concerts were held regularly. We had a violin which was later sold for food, a clarinet and guitar, plus our female attire which we had bought from Singapore. I took part in those concerts. 14. Scrounging. Sunday was a day of rest. We used to sneak out on scrounging parties and bring back goats, which we killed and ate. Of course, the Japanese knew nothing about this. 15. Food. The quality of rice at Victoria Point was shocking and full of grubs. We ate our breakfast consisting of either plain rice or, if we were lucky, rice and coconut juice. In the dark, we ate worms, weevils, and rice altogether. We killed a beast called a yak about once a week between 300 men. It was tough meat, but tasted good to us. 16. Effort at humiliation. The Japs were always trying to humiliate us by slinging up to us how we threw up our hands to surrender. 17. Departure. We left Victoria Point, 6 August 1942, headed for Tavoy, on the west coast of Burma, on board a small ship called the 5 Part 93. August 6, 1942 to October 21, 1942. Voyage. This was a replica of my last trip. It was a smaller boat. Many were seasick, but I had more food on this trip as I had visited my native friends before leaving. So, had a fair supply of bananas, fish, a couple of tins of pineapple, and a couple of coconuts. 2. Arrival. We got off the 593 on the 6th August at 2 p.m. We transferred to a barge which took us up the river to Tavoy. We were packed like sardines in the hold of this barge, and the heat was horrific. Many men fainted from exhaustion. We arrived at Tavoy at midnight and marched about 5 miles to our new camp, arriving at 3 a.m. We met Dutch POWs for the first time. We were camped in what was originally an American mission school, run by an American missionary and his wife. I was camped in a building adjoining the school. This building had a wooden floor and stood about 15 feet off the ground. We were camped on the outskirts of the city, which is quite a fair-sized place, with hundreds of temples and pagodas. 3. Outside wire. Once again, it was possible to escape through the wire and contact the natives, but it was much tougher here than it has been before. Japanese guards patrolled the wire, and we had it drilled into us if we were caught outside, we would be shot. Therefore, very few attempted it, so we had to be very careful. Articles of clothing brought fair prices in Tavoy, and in return for clothing, we could get rice cakes, bananas, cucumbers, and eggs. I made contact through a Christian Burmese woman who was once married to an Australian mining engineer with the Chief Commissioner of Police, who was interned in the Tavoy jail. I received a letter from him about the conditions of the jail. Many had died of dysentery and beriberi. There were about 20 Europeans left in the jail. This Burmese woman's Australian husband had been killed in a mining accident, and she had gone back to her old profession of midwifery and was attending the jailer's wife. That is how she managed to contact the civilians in this jail. She was very good to me, giving me food. She had a son somewhere in the AIF. Her name was Mrs. Sinclair. We were chased by the Japs on several occasions, but managed to get back to camp before they could check who was missing. 4. Guard duty. The Japs made our authorities put a guard on the fence and threatened to shoot the officer of the guard and his men if anyone attempted to escape. Natives would throw cigars over the fence, also notes containing war news to the guards. 5. Work. Work was harder than at Victoria Point, and the food was very poor. We worked on the aerodrome, leveling off the ground and draining same for an all-weather aerodrome and building new runways. We saw a Japanese plane crash whilst landing one day. We would excavate earth from the edge of the aerodrome and fill up rice bags, which 2 men would carry on their shoulders by means of a bamboo pole. Other work we did was to cut down rubber trees for firewood used in the kitchen. We would pull 1914 British Army limbers through mud up to our knees, loaded up with wood, back to camp. It was the wet season while we were in Tavoy and rained continuously for days on end. The average rainfall in this area was 200 to 300 inches per year. We worked rain or shine, with no Sunday off as we had in the past. I received my first bashing whilst in Tavoy. 4 of us were caught not working. We had our heads knocked together and hit over the head with a shovel, not the best of sensations. A new game of the Japs was to make 2 of our men slap one another across the face for punishment. Knowing how we hated doing this, because on several occasions we had refused to do it and had received in return for our refusal a terrific bashing from them. Once they knocked a man to the ground, they would kick him in the head, stomach, and testicles. No one dared raise his hands to hit the Japs as the threat of being shot was not to be taken lightly. 6. Guards. We had rather old Japanese soldiers as guards for a short time. They treated us fairly well. Most of the trouble of bashings during working hours came from the Japanese engineers who were in charge of us during daylight hours. 7. Attempted escape. 8 Aussies, all from 2/4th Anti-Tank Regiment, including 2 of 3 others, were shot to death for attempting to escape. They stole a Japanese truck and were heading north, when they were caught the following day. They were brought back in without trial, taken out in the bush, forced to dig their own graves, had their legs and arms bound behind their back, and forced in a sitting position by a pole, which extended from the back of their neck to their feet, and shot. These shootings were witnessed by a number of men detailed to fill in the graves. Note: these men were forced to watch the shooting. Colonel Anderson V.C. has the names of the Japanese responsible for these men's deaths. 8. Sabotage. Few opportunities arose to do a certain amount of sabotage work at Tavoy whilst loading and unloading Japanese ships, e.g., removing bolts from their rifles and throwing them into the sea, also removing the locks from machine guns and doing likewise. 9. Offer of escape. A pro-British Burmese native who spoke fluent English made an offer to take a friend and myself up in the mountains where we would be cared for by Christian Burmese until such a time as the British retook Tavoy. The idea appealed to me, but Major Cameron advised me against it, because according to him, the news was excellent, and whereas there was little danger of dying with the force, jungle diseases and the ever-present danger of being caught did not justify the risk. I took his advice. A point of interest: Major Cameron represented Western Australia at the King's coronation. 10. Scrounging. I managed to scrounge from the Japanese while in Tavoy. 15 tins bully beef, 14 tins Heinz Irish stew, 20 pounds white sugar. If ever I had been caught, God only knows what punishment I would have received, but my luck was holding well. 11. Jimmy hits back. The only case of our fellows hitting a Japanese and getting away with it was as follows. We had orders. We were not to talk to the Dutch POWs, for what reason no one knew. Jimmy Hayes of 22nd Res MT Khoi was caught talking to a group of Dutchmen. The Dutch wore a green uniform, and the Aussies were khaki. Thus he picked him. He put the bayonet on his rifle and kept prodding Jimmy with his bayonet, drawing blood from his shoulder. Jimmy saw red and landed a beautiful punch on the Jap soldier's jaw and knocked him down. The soldier got up and walked away. That was the last he heard of it. Lucky for Jimmy. 12. Canteen. We had our first organized canteen in Tavoy. We were being paid 10 cents per day at this time, and it was not until December 1942 that our pay rose to 25 cents. Available were bananas, cucumbers, and rice cakes. 13. Shaving equipment. I forgot to mention I had no razor blades when I became a POW, so I, like many others, grew a beard. It was a beautiful long black beard. In the 2 years, 7 months I was a POW, I doubt if I used the equivalent of 3 bars of soap. Thus, the pores of our skin were very dirty and sores were always breaking out on our legs. Later, they developed into tropical ulcers, of which you will hear more later. We had plenty of water to wash with, and it was difficult to keep clothes clean without soap. 14. Departure. We had received many rumors about leaving for Rangoon, and eventually we left on the 20th October for Mulmine on board the Kunza Maru. I had my second engagement anniversary on board, 21st of October. Colonel Ramsey and Major Cameron had made contact with native intelligence who were operating under British orders. Word was sent to British authorities that we were leaving for Rangoon. When we were first informed of a move by the Japanese, Colonel Ramsey received word to watch out for a British destroyer 2 days out from Tavoy. We did not leave until a week later than we had anticipated, and, although word was sent out to these natives, we received no reply in time. Nevertheless, a number of men were secretly given instructions to take over serious parts of the ship from the Japs on a given password. Lieutenant Mazerol was in charge of retaking the engine room. Although a close lookout was kept, nothing was sighted, and the voyage was uneventful except that we had a little more space than on the previous 2 trips. I did not know about the retaking of the ship until after we arrived, as the men taking part were sworn to secrecy. I was later told from good authority of the plan, and can vouch for the authenticity of it. October 22, 1942 to December 1, 1942. 1. Arrival. We steamed up the muddy Salween River, with the mudflats stretching for miles on either side of us to Mulmine, and marched to jail, a distance of about 1 mile. Indian and Burmese men, women, and children rushed out into the streets to witness the spectacle. Japanese guards marched on either side of us, but it did not stop the natives sneaking bananas and cigars to us. We slept on slabs of wood with a cement block for a pillow, and had plenty of bugs and lice for company. It was my first night in a real jail. 2. Departure. Next morning, we marched about 4 miles to the railway station, and were herded like sheep into kettle trucks, about 30 men to each truck. The train engine was a very old type, and was driven with wood as fuel. Coal had ceased to exist for the Japanese. 3. Arrival. Arrived, Thanbyzuat, 33 miles from Mulmine, about 4 p.m. This was the marshalling yards and workshop for the Lower Burma Railway. This is where we saw our first bamboo-constructed huts, with atop palm leaf roofs. Round bamboo made up the flooring, and, on each bamboo, upright pole was a poster, "Work cheerfully." This, we thought, was rather humorous. This camp was for all POWs working on the Burma side of the Burma-Thailand Railway. Whilst we were at Tavoy, about 500 men had gone to Yi, a coastal port between Tavoy and Mulmine. These men had already begun work about a fortnight previously on the building of the railway. Also, there were several thousand Dutchmen working at the time of our arrival. The 2/4 CCS units formed the hospital at Thanbyzuat, and on the following day, the 23rd October, we marched to the 4-kilo camp called Kandaw to be initiated in the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway line. 4. Camp. The camp was built in the fork of a fairly deep stream and in between rows of rubber trees. It had previously been used by the Tamil Indians who had worked on the rubber plantation. This is where we first met body lice and bugs, which clung to us for the remainder of our POW days. At first, we could not sleep with the never-ending biting of these creatures, and it was a daily job to go through our shirts and shoes to kill these pests, and where we adopted the habit of scratching our bodies all day and all night. Before we left Thanbyzuat, Colonel Nagatama, Chief of POWs in Burma, read a speech which was interpreted by a Dutchman named Cornelius Punt. We were informed that we were just the rabble of the broken British Army who surrendered and threw up our hands at Singapore, and that we should weep tears of gratitude at having our lives spared and being able to participate in the construction of the mighty Burma-Thailand Railway line. There were 1,000 men in our camp and in each other camp. Each camp was about 5 kilometers apart. Englishmen captured in Java, plus Aussies from the Middle East, also captured in Java, and American sailors and Marines from the cruiser Houston and 131st Texas Field Artillery Regiment, also taken in Java, were working on this line. A total of about 5,000 Australians. I don't know how many Dutchmen, English, and Americans, but there was a total of 10,000 white POWs, plus many thousands of natives, Indians, working between Thanbyzuat, Okilo, and the 114-kilo camp, Burma-Thailand boundary. 5. Deaths. Many thousands of POWs and natives were also working towards us from Thailand on the same job. Between October 1942 and the completion of the line in January 1944, 17,000 white POWs had been buried in the jungles of Burma and Thailand. It is estimated that a POW died every 7 sleepers that were laid, and a native to every sleeper. These figures are authentic and will give the reader some idea of what conditions were like on this job. Deaths were caused by cholera, malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and malnutrition. Had we been properly fed and had plenty of medical supplies, only a matter of a few hundred would have died. It was just murder on the part of the Japanese. 47,000 natives died on this job. 6. 4-kilo camp. We were given numbers on a piece of wood and put into 50s, which was called a kumi, under command of a lieutenant, POW, who was called the kumichao. 2 kumis, made of 100 men, made a hand under command of a captain, POW, hanchao. Here was where we had to start learning Japanese. For example, yotsuki, attention. Yes me, at ease. Keri, salute. Shigoto, work. Osh, okay. Bugero, damn fool. Kandaru, Japanese swear word. Bungo, number. We had to learn numbers in Japanese. We were fortunate in this camp for water, and we could have a bath and swim after work. All the time we were POWs, excluding Singapore and Saigon. All our drinking water had to be boiled, owing to the danger of cholera, the deadliest of all tropical diseases. 7. Bombing of ship. Whilst we were in this camp, POWs from Sumatra arrived in Thanbyzuat. A ship containing English, Australian, and Dutch POWs was bombed by a Liberator bomber just 2 days from Mulmine. The plane scored a direct hit on a ship containing war materials, petrol, railway lines, etc., also loaded with Japanese soldiers, and got a near miss on the ship containing the POWs. Many men lost their lives through this bombing. 8. Escape. An Aussie from 2/3 Res MT called Whitfield escaped from this camp and lived with the Burmese people for about a month before he gave himself up. He was shot to death at Thanbyzuat. 9. Trading. At first, the Japanese allowed us to buy from the natives such things as chandigar, Burmese brown sugar, curried meat, tobacco leaf, which we pressed in plugs, eggs, bananas, etc. This was soon stopped as they were afraid we might gather information from them, or they would help us to escape. 10. Work. Work commenced just as the sun was coming up. Our officers never had to work, but came out on the job to look after our interests. Some did a really good job and received many bashings for doing so, and others had no guts at all. Each man had to dig 1.2 cubic meters a day and carry the earth he dug out to form the foundation of the railway line. Earth was carried by bag and pole on the shoulders with baskets at each end of the pole. This was our first hard work, and we sweated and worked like blazes to get it finished. When we finished, and not before, we could go home. Before we left this camp, we were shifting 1.4 meters per man per day. It was in the camp that the Japs said there were too many men sick and demanded so many men to go to work each day. As time went on, things got from bad to worse, both as regards to sickness, then later blitzing sick men out to work. The building of bridges was also done by hand. No machinery was used in the construction of the whole railway line. Piles were driven 15 feet into the ground, 20 men on each side pulling on a rope of 500-pound weight. December 1st, 1942 to March 3rd, 1943. Thetkaw. 1. Arrival. I left Kandaw at 9 a.m. for 14-kilo camp, Thetkaw, by motor truck as I had a topical ulcer on my leg and was classed unfit to march. It was a well-laid-out camp with bamboo huts, atap roofs, good stream for bathing surrounded by mountains. 2. Work. Work was becoming much harder. At 4-kilo camp, the earth we excavated was good, easy digging in comparison to this camp. We were gradually coming into the jungle, and an area of jungle about 25 yards either side of where the line was to be built had to be cleared by hand with just a parang, Burmese machete about 18 inches long, and axes. Trees had to be chopped down and rooted out, and the undergrowth of jungle cleared by hacking at it with a parang. After digging down about a foot, we would strike clay, which made the going tough. Also, with just picks and shovels, we had to dig out cuttings in the hills as much as 60 feet deep through clay and solid rock. The glare from these clay cuttings in the hills and lack of vitamins caused many men to go temporarily blind, and men today are suffering from eye trouble. Their eyes are too weak to be able to read a book. The camp was the beginning of our downward grade in health. Men came home completely exhausted. Heart racing was a common complaint through heat and strain. The heat was horrific working in these cuttings. We worked about 4 miles either side of the camp, and mess orderlies go back for our food, the everlasting rice. It was rice 3 times a day, every day, for 2 years, 7 months. We were getting very watery stews for lunch and tea, containing often just melons, pepper, and salt. Occasionally, we would get a small beast killed between 1,000 men, so you can see we did not get many vitamins into our systems. Pellagra in the mouth was a very common complaint, causing the tongue to be very inflamed and cut about, making eating an agony. An acute shortage of medical supplies was becoming very noticeable. Ever since we had become prisoner, we had to supply our own bandages, which were made by cutting up old shirts. Later, liquid rubber was used extensively for covering small sores. Weeping tinea on the testicles was treated by putting on a coating of wet clay. This proved to be very effective. Condy's crystals was used when obtainable for diarrhea by drinking it with water to disinfect the stomach. If you reported to the doctor with either dysentery or diarrhea, you would be told not to eat for that day and to take 1 spoonful of powdered charcoal 3 times a day. Owing to the fact that the doctor was responsible for keeping up the work figures, it was necessary, if you had diarrhea, to bring a sample for him to examine. This was done mainly to stop bludgers from putting one over on the doctor. At one time, I saw a man pay 25 cents for a sample from a genuine diarrhea patient to enable him to get a day off. No holidays, working 7 days a week, made him to resort to all sorts of lurks to get a day off. At this camp, I broke a bone in my toe and also had several ulcers, which saved me many a day's toil. The Japs on the job, engineers, were getting harder and harder. Bashings were becoming more frequent and for trivial offenses. E.g., you might be unfortunate enough to break a pick handle whilst digging in a rock cutting. You would get hit on the head with the pick handle, or the Japs might think you had been too long at the banjo, latrine, and slap you on the face. 3. Blitzing. Blitzing came into operation in this camp and continued until the railway line was finished. E.g., we were 1,000 men strong, and the Japanese engineer in charge of work would demand that 800 men go out to work on the line. That left 200 men, out of which came the cooks, buppin, camp workers such as wood choppers, latrine diggers, hospital orderlies, and officers. So, you see, for men fast declining in health suffering from malaria, diarrhea, dysentery, beriberi, pellagra in the mouth and stomach, malnutrition, etc., there were not to be many sick, and our doctors had a very hard time of it classifying fittest of the sick. He would probably, 7 days out of 7, still be down on figures. So the fit and light sick would go to work, and then the rest would go on parade no matter how sick they were, and line up for a Japanese guard inspection. Perhaps 50 more men were required. We would go along the line and grunt at each man and ask him complaint. If you had malaria and probably running a temperature of 102 or 103 degrees, he would grab your arm just anywhere and pretend to feel your pulse. 9 times out of 10, I don't think they knew how to take a pulse. He would grunt and say, "Skigoda," work, and give you a shove over to the work line. Therefore, it did not pay to bludge on your mates. This happened every day. Really sick men forced to go to work. These sick men who were sent to work, we shouldered and helped them with their jobs as best we could. This was the beginning of the cause of thousands of deaths. Further along the line at the 105 Kilo camp, I have seen men drop dead whilst on the job. Our officers appealed time and time again to have this blitzing stopped, but it still went on. 4. Escape. Captain Mull of Sydney, AASC, formerly an officer in the British Army in India, made it generally known he was planning to escape through the jungle to the Indian border, and was looking for 2 or 3 men to go with him. I was in this enterprise until 2 days before he made his break, but owing to breaking a bone in my toe, the doctor said I would never make it. Therefore, I am in possession of the true facts of Captain Mull's plan. Alec Bell of Ballarat, who had lived in New Guinea for 7 years as a metallurgist on a gold mine and lived 3 years in Malaya, doing the same job at Raub, was a member of the party. This fellow joined the AIF in Malaya about a fortnight before the capitulation in preference of an opportunity to evacuate the island with other civilians. He understood map reading and native language really well. The third member of the party who took my place 2 days before they left was Dickinson, who was a surveyor in civilian life. Captain Mull understood the Hindustani language and native habits, as he had been amongst them for years in India. It was a well-organized plan throughout and prepared for months ahead. At this time, officers were receiving 20 rupees a month, and therefore the problem of buying food was overcome. Rice was plentiful at this period, and Captain Mull obtained from the cook house 42 pounds of dry rice. When they left, they had 14 pounds of dry rice each, 2 bundles of about 2 pounds of dried fish each, 6 hard-boiled eggs each, 50 cigars each approximately, 6 boxes matches, 2 tins, 1 pound, steak and kidney pudding, 2 prismatic compasses, 1 pair binoculars, 1 parang, machete, each several well-defined maps. Unfortunately, no firearms. Dr. Anderson supplied them with quinine, which was nearly always plentiful, Condy's crystals, etc., and also a bottle of silver nitrate for darkening their skin. Captain Mull had saved a considerable sum of money. Japanese, Burmese, and silver Indian rupees, currencies, were to be used for bribing the natives. They worked on their rations lasting 14 days, when they would be well away from the area, and then would rely on scrounging and bribing the natives. Several Dutchmen had escaped a few months previously and had been caught and sentenced to life imprisonment, hard labor, in the Mull Mine jail. Captain Mull managed to get to Thanbyzuat on the pretense of getting his teeth attended to, and got particulars from these Dutchmen's friends where they had been caught, so as not to fall into the same trap. Brigadier Varley tried to talk Captain Mull from going, but he was determined to see it through. He planned on marching 10 miles per day, which is damn good going through jungle country. The distance, the way he mapped it out, was 800 miles to the Indian border, which meant it would take 80 days, just enough time before the wet season broke, which would have made it impossible to travel. That is why they could not afford to wait till my toe was better. The day prior to their leaving, Captain Mull was caught buying bananas from a native and given a bashing, and the bananas were given to our camp hospital. His plan was to travel due east toward Thailand for 3 days, then north for 6 days, then in a northwest direction, crossing the fork of the Salween River, passing about 200 miles north of Rangoon. All this traveling was to be done keeping to the hills and traveling through the jungle. The clothing worn by the party was long trousers, long-sleeved shirt boots, hat, and carrying a ground sheet. Each man carried a pack weighing 25 to 30 pounds. The camp held boxing tournaments occasionally, but was shortly stopped owing to the poor physical condition of the contestants. But on the evening Captain Mole and his party left, a boxing tournament was in progress, and just on dark they received the good wishes of the few who knew of their departure. It was kept secret from the Japs until about 4 p.m. the following day, when their absence was reported. I was very disgusted to think our authorities reported that matter to the NIP so early, because at that time the evening checkup was not thorough, and men could have been substituted on the evening checkup. At the time, a Jap corporal was in charge of our camp. He wore a long black beard and was nicknamed Brother Jonathan. As soon as it became known of the escape, all men were brought back to camp for a thorough count. A thorough kit inspection, lasting till dark, then took place, revealing binoculars, maps, compasses, etc., which were naturally confiscated. Truckloads of Japs and Burmese set out in search of the escapees. The Japs, when anyone escapes, offers a large sum of money to any native bringing back the escapee, dead or alive. Word passes by word of mouth right throughout the jungle of such an offer, and the Burmese native scours the jungle to win such a reward. 2 nights after the escape, Dickinson stumbled into base camp with a ricked ankle and malaria. The Japs tried to make him talk of the direction and plans of the other two, but Dickinson met his death without betraying the whereabouts of Captain Mole and Alec Bell. Approximately 3 weeks later, Alec Bell was brought into base camp in a terrible condition. His story to his padre was as follows. Dickinson ricked his ankle the night after they escaped and had to be left to make his way back to camp in the hopes they had not been missed. Their food lasted about 18 days, and they had come down from the hills to obtain food when a shot rang out. Captain Mole was shot dead. Another shot scored a hit on Bell's arm. Unarmed, as he was, and very fatigued, he had no option but to surrender, and outstepped 6 Burmese with .303 rifles. He was bound hand and foot and taken back to camp in a pitiable condition. His arm had turned gangrene, and he had not eaten for over a week. He was immediately imprisoned in the Jap guardhouse. A POW doctor and the Methodist padre were allowed to visit Bell. Bell refused to allow the doctor to dress his arm as he knew he was to be shot, and told the doctor to use his bandages on someone more needy. Bell was a very religious lad, and a cleaner living fellow you could not have met. He requested the padre to say prayers with him, and also requested for a certain hymn to be sung. Normal procedure when a man is to be shot is to bind both his hands and feet and blindfold him, put him in a truck, and take him to the cemetery 200 yards from the camp. Bell requested to be allowed to meet his death as a soldier. This request was granted, and Bell marched to the cemetery with his head held high. The brigadier and doctor had to witness all these shootings, and this was stated by Brigadier Varley at Bell's funeral, which was attended by all patients from hospital who could walk. Bell stood at his gravesite and requested to meet his death without being blindfolded. This was granted. He then told the Japanese commander through the interpreter that he held nothing against him or the firing party, as they were doing their duty and he had considered he had done his. The Japanese were really moved, and was blind drunk for several days after. I imagine his conscience was pricking him. The day these men escaped, Captain West was grabbed by the Japs as an accomplice in helping these men escape as he slept next to Captain Mole. He was expected to know all their plans, which he did know. He was taken out in the jungle and whipped with a bullock pizzle and threatened to be shot. But they picked the wrong fellow. He even had a firing party with leveling rifles awaiting the order to shoot, but he refused to open his mouth. He was in a pretty bad condition for many days with welts all over his body. I often look back and think how lucky I was that I broke the bone in my toe. 5. Guards. Brother Jonathan was taken away in disgrace for allowing a POW to escape, and was replaced by a Jap Lieutenant Hosky, who allowed the Japs to bash us. He remained with us until our work was finished on the line. Late in November, Korean guards armed with British rifles were put over us. It was a black day for us when these swine took over control. They were the type of fellow who I imagine had been drink waiters in Japan, and the sudden authority that was given to them was most certainly taken advantage of. It was not long before they were also given nicknames according to their different looks and ways. The BB, the BB's Cobber, Blackadder, Glamour Boy, Boof, the Bull, Dillinger, Frankenstein, Stormtrooper, Twinkletoes, etc., etc., were a few of the names we bestowed on them. At this time, we had been without green vegetables, and for many months to come their absence was sorely felt. Therefore, under our doctor's instructions, different leaves were picked from the jungle, including bamboo shoots. They were washed and boiled by us on our own individual fires and eaten. These leaves were supposed to contain the vitamins our body was lacking. It was great sport for the BB, who was a big bloated-faced, sulky-looking Korean guard, to walk around our fires, and for no reason whatsoever. He would kick our billies off the fire and tip out our leaves. Dillinger got his nickname as follows. Toilet paper was a thing of the past, and green leaves were the substitute. The camp area was soon cleaned out of leaves, and men would bring home a handful from work. A sergeant from Colonel Anderson's force, walking home from work along a jungle track, stepped off the track to get some leaves and was shot and killed by this Dillinger on the grounds that he was attempting to escape. Glamour Boy was not a bad-looking nip, and he knew it, but cross his track and he could be a terror. The Bull was in charge of the nip kitchen, and 10 of our men each day were detailed to chop wood and peel vegetables for them. We always took a chance on not being searched and would scrounge a couple of onions or a pocketful of salt. Every day or so, when we joined up to salute and be dismissed, he would search us, as if we were caught with anything, would receive a bashing, and made to stand at attention for an hour or so in the sun without a hat. Twinkletoes was in the nip hospital adjoining our hospital in Saigon. He was bumble-footed, thus his nickname. Prior going to hospital, he was always bashing our fellows up, and the cooks tried to do away with him as follows. He would call on one of the cooks to give him 2 eggs to make an omelet for himself. When the omelet was cooked, the cooks would wipe the germ of a dysentery patient across the omelet in the hopes he would get dysentery and die. But only the good die. He lived. I could write for hours on these individual Japs, but I would never finish this story. 6. Concerts and Christmas. Concerts were resumed again after a long period of being without them, and Christmas Eve was made as bright as possible by us with a concert and community singing. 7. Mail. It was whilst we were in this camp that permission was given to write home. 3 times during our POW days this was granted, and 1 wireless message was sent from Saigon. These letter cards had a lot of bunk printed on them, and 3 lines were left for us, a letter of about 20 words. We never believed they arrived. 8. Movies. Our officers were told they were to attend a movie in Thanbyzuat. They marched 10 miles to see it and were forced to see the complete show lasting 5 hours, and were then marched back to camp. The movie consisted of the Pearl Harbor bombing, the Battle of Singapore, and other films showing the almighty Jap in his victorious marches to victory to such places as Burma, Philippines, etc. It was very weak propaganda and very much stretched. We later had the opportunity of seeing 2 of these films. 9. Newspapers. An English edition of the Greater East Asia newspaper, printed in Rangoon, was made available to us 2 and 3 times a week, and many a laugh we had from it. Also, by reversing the losses and gains, we gathered some world news. Of what I am now to write, every word of it was in these papers. I will endeavor to write it as we read it. 1. 50 of our planes today raided Chittagong, an advanced base in India. 20 planes were destroyed on the ground. 15 of 20 interceptors were shot down. 2 of our planes failed to return to their base as they crash-dived into enemy objectives. 2. A bomber pilot from our Imperial Air Force operating in the Southwest Pacific area dropped his bombs a little too early. So he dived down under the bombs, caught them, balanced them on his wingtips, and balanced them there until he reached his target. Then he tilted his plane, causing the bombs to drop, scoring a direct hit. 3. A fighter plane returning to its base noticed a lone British ship in the Bay of Bengal. Having no bombs left and out of ammunition, the pilot noticed the captain standing on the bridge, and with a bitter feeling of hatred for the British, he dived down, drew his sword, and just missed the bridge, slashing the head of the captain off with his sword. The pilot was decorated for his heroic deed. 4. In the Southwest Pacific, a fighter pilot's guns jammed as he was being attacked by the two Allied fighters. Maneuvering into such a position above them, he suddenly remembered he had 2 rice cakes in his plane. So, he threw these rice cakes at the enemy planes. The Allied pilots, thinking they were hand grenades, dived steeply to avoid them. The Japanese forced them so low that they could not pull out of their dive in time. Both planes crashed into the sea. 5. A Japanese pilot, on returning to his base in Burma, was intercepted by 2 British planes. He gave them a very hot reception. Suddenly an idea formed in his mind, and withdrawing his revolver, he leveled it at the British pilots, beckoning them to surrender and return with him to Nippon base as his prisoners. One British pilot held up his fist. His face was red with rage. But rather than face certain death at the hands of the Nippon's revolver, both planes were escorted back to Nippon's airbase. This pilot received the Order of the Golden Kite, a much-honored decoration for this daring deed. 6. A pilot returning to his base in Burma noticed the landing gear of his fighter plane had been shot away by enemy ack-ack fire. As he came close to the ground to land, he knocked a hole in the bottom of his plane, and with his feet and dangling his legs down, he ran along the ground carrying his plane with his hands, bringing same to safety. March 3, 1943 to August 15, 1943. Milo and Thanbyzuat. 1. Arrival. We left 14 Kilo Amp on 3rd March by truck for 75 Kilo Camp, arriving feeling very sore and hungry. 25 men in each truck over a bumpy roadway is not a pleasant trip. 2. Camp. The camp was situated in an ideal position, closely surrounded on 3 sides by steep mountains. A deep stream, about 30 yards wide, ran alongside the camp. Many a good swim we had in this river. The Japs used to get fresh fish by throwing hand grenades in the river. Plain bamboo huts with an atap palm leaf roof was our quarters. Colonel Ramsey and Colonel Black's forces moved in with us while we were in camp, approximately 2,500 men all told. 3. Work. Work was very hard in this camp, as we were in very heavy jungle country, which had to be cleared. We were assisted by elephants in this camp. These elephants were used for hauling bridge piles to the job and pulling out tree stumps. Also, being mountainous country, the work was mainly digging 60-inch deep cuttings, often through solid rock. It was whilst at this camp we were informed by the Japs that the railway had to be linked up with the Thailand side by October, as it was to be used to transport Jap soldiers and equipment to the India-Burma border. This was a colossal task, and we thought it impossible. However, the pressure was put on, and blitzing became severe, sick men being forced to work. We were hard at work at daylight, and for several weeks worked until 2 and 3 a.m., under the light of fires. Burnt dry rice, which we termed camouflage coffee, was our beverage whilst working. Many more bashings were dealt out to us by both guards and engineers. Men came home from work in the early morning, dead beat. 4. Hoax. Each morning the Japs would detail a certain amount of work to be done for the day, with the promise that when the work was finished, all men would go home to camp. Many times, the Japs, to show that they still had the upper hand, would delight in tormenting us by forcing all men to dig a half cubic meter of extra earth. 5. Malaria. It was in this camp that malaria first hit us on a large scale. Dozens of men each day contracted it. There were many mosquitoes in this area, and we had no protection from them, having no nets. Our resistance to sickness was at a very low ebb. I contracted my first bout of malaria here. 6. Snakes. The rainy season commenced whilst we were here, and hundreds of snakes infested the camp area and jungle. It is surprising to note, with the hundreds of snakes we saw in Burma, I did not know of a single instance of any man being bitten. We saw snakes of many colors and sizes, the largest of which was a python, 20 inches in length. 7. Food canteen. The food situation was gradually getting worse here, as we were moving away from civilization, and our canteen practically ceased to operate as nearly everything was unprocurable. We had to rely on the Burmese for canteen goods and cigars, which were transported by yak carts from Thanbyzuat, 75 kilometers away. Therefore, the trip was not made too often. 8. Clothing. Our clothes were very much worn out, and work was done wearing a lap, a G-string or loincloth. Shirts were not worn, owing to the horrific heat. Even when it was raining, the clammy heat was horrific. 9. Photos. Norman Fraser of the 2/4th Machine Gun Battalion had smuggled a camera and dozens of films when he marched to Changi in 1942. These were well hidden when a search was instigated. He took many interesting photos, such as Japs bashing our fellows, working on the line, boxing tournaments, camp cemeteries, huts, etc. Unfortunately, this lad died of cholera a few months later, but his mate took his camera and films and intends to get them developed when he gets home. Many risks were taken to get these snaps, and it would have been a severe punishment if he had been caught. 10. Concert and consequences. I worked the feminine part in a play called The Poor Little Mill Girl, which was well received. The Japanese commander was rather impressed with the show and commanded that it should be filmed for a propaganda picture, which was to be shot at Thanbyzuat on the Emperor's birthday, April 29th. The brass band and instruments at this period were still intact and were given the music, Japanese Victory March, and forced to learn it and play it for the same film. We left by truck for Thanbyzuat, 27th April. 11. Nightmare March. On the 13th May, at 10 p.m., the remainder of the camp started on a nightmare march for the 105-kilo camp called Ankanan. The journey was made over an unmade road with large stones, potholes, mud and slush over our ankles. Many men's boots had worn out. If you did not take over a size 8 boot, you got a pair if you were lucky, from the nips. They were a very poor class of boot and soon packed up, walking in mud and slush over stones every day. There were 2 Jap boot issues whilst we were POW. From August 1943 to September 1944, I walked in bare feet as my boots were worn out, and I take size 9.5. After having worked all hours of the day and night for several weeks, and working until 2 a.m., this march started. Men were in a pitiful condition, many suffering from tropical ulcers and malaria. Only the worst remaining at the 75 kilo to follow up by transport when the road was made. 12. Thanbyzuat trip. The concert part and band arrived at Thanbyzuat at 11 p.m. on 27th April. New huts had been erected since we were last there. They were quite decent huts made of wooden sides and floors with a tap palm leaf roof, but were infected with bugs and lice. The camp was a model camp built for propaganda purposes. 13. Sickness. There were 8 long huts about 40 yards long, plus a dysentery hut isolated from the rest, a special ward for operations and very sick patients, and an operating theater. All these huts were practically full of sick men with such ailments as tropical ulcers, dysentery, beriberi, rheumatism, diarrhea, and many other such complaints. 14. Rackets. Many rackets were in operation in this camp by light sick patients. The sale of coffee, 5 cents a cup, rice rissoles, 10 cents each, cake made from rice flour and slices of pineapple, 10 cents each, etc., were made and sold to anyone lucky enough to have a few cents. This was the best camp in Burma, and the men fed well. Still, rice 3 times a day, but they had pretty good stews with meat and vegetables to go with it. It was poor food, but good in comparison to the food the men in the jungle were getting. The canteen operated here. Pineapples, peanuts, bananas, eggs, and cigars were procurable. The officers made a monthly donation to the POW camp hospital, which enabled the sick to have an egg and 2 bananas a day. I was in the pineapple business here, buying same for 50 cents each, peeling and slicing into 8 pieces and getting 20 cents per slice, making a profit of 30 cents per pineapple. 16. Emperor's Birthday. A well-built stage was erected, and the filming of The Poor Little Mill Girl, along with other items and the band, was filmed. The canteen was filled with all sorts of food we had not seen since we became POWs, which we purchased with money previously given to us before the film was shot. Films were taken of the huts and sick men from a distance, and only of those who did not look sick. Also, a film of one of our doctor-surgeons performing an operation on a fake patient. The humorous side of the propaganda film was the fact that our authorities worked things so that one man was at each place they filmed. In other words, the same man filmed at the canteen was also filmed in bed as a patient, in the concert party, and also being operated on. So, I imagine that the propaganda film would not have much effect on the people back home. 16. Illness. I got my second bout of malaria the day of the concert and just managed to get through my part. I had a temperature of 104 degrees and was admitted to hospital. I was just about fit for discharge when I had a relapse of malaria and contracted the terrible disease of dysentery. No one will ever realize the pain one goes through with dysentery and the weight one can lose and yet still live. Dysentery was a deadly disease and claimed many lives. I had dysentery on and off until August 1943, 3 months, and lost much weight. My weight today is 11 stone and 3 pounds. When I had dysentery in this camp, my weight was as low as 6 stone, 7 pounds. 17. Bombings. I forgot to mention that whilst we were at Thetkaw, 2nd March 1943, an American bomber dropped flares all around this hospital camp and dropped bombs near a petrol dump, just missing it by 100 yards. When we saw the flares, we naturally thought that our position must have been made known to the Allied authorities. Imagine our surprise when 18. First bombing. On June 14, 6 4-engined Liberator bombers, the first we had ever seen, flew over our huts and the American marking could be discerned. They flew quite low. The men were wild with joy and rushed outside their respective huts, waving and shouting. The planes flew around in a wide arc, and we imagined they were going back to bomb Amherst, a few miles from us, and we listened for explosions. Instead, they circled right round and came back towards us at a height of approximately 5,000 feet. We all thought perhaps they were going to drop pamphlets or even paratroops. Instead, we saw those black eggs leave the body of the plane, their objective being the junction of the Burma and Yi Railway, about 100 yards from the camp boundary. Direct hits were scored. We wasted no time in making for the slit trenches, which had been dug all around the huts. Circling again, they dropped more bombs, the closest to us landing on the roadway immediately next to the camp. A small number of POWs were killed when a direct hit on a build-up water tower was scored. These men were pumping water to the camp kitchen and did not have time to take shelter. There were no Japs killed in this raid. 19. Second day's bombing. Next day was a repeat performance, scoring direct hits on 2 of our huts, killing many POWs. Many men narrowly averted death by being buried when their slit trenches caved in. Owing to the presence of mind of other POWs who dug them out before they had time to suffocate, many lives were saved. We were satisfied the planes mistook our hospital camp for a concentration camp of Jap soldiers. There were no Jap soldiers killed in the second raid. 20. Nationalities. There were many nationalities represented in this camp: Australians, English, Dutch, American, survivors of the American cruiser Houston, 131st Texas Field Artillery. 21. Water. Before the rainy season broke, 6 wells sunk to a depth of about 30 feet were dug, but these failed to give much water. We were rationed to 1 condensed milk tin of water per man per day to wash in, and received half a water bottle of water per man per day for drinking purposes. 22. Departure. The Japs decided to shift the hospital camp after the second day's raid, and very few got transport, many of us having to march. Some went to the 4-kilo camp, some to the 8-kilo camp, and some to the 18-kilo camp by foot, to shortly after all congregate at the new hospital camp at Ratpu, 30 kilometers away. The 8-kilo camp to which I marched was the remains of what had formerly been a Dutch working camp and was in a very broken state. We built many humpy-style accommodation containing half a dozen men to sleep in. They were very leaky and we were wet through for several days, with rain, and there were some very sick men there. Thanbyzuat Cemetery was full when we left. We witnessed several more bombings from this camp, and Thanbyzuat was laid flat. 23. Working Party. The fittest of the sick men were forced to march back to Thanbyzuat and fill in bomb craters on the roadways and railway line. Pamphlets in Hindustani and Burmese were later dropped here, warning the natives to stay away from Jap camps and towns because of more bombings to follow. 24. Arrival. We left the Kilo camp and arrived at Ratpu, 30 Kilo camp, about 25th June. 25. Camp. The camp was built alongside a fair-sized stream, and the huts were very leaky. 2 meals a day was all we had for several weeks. 26. Scrounging. I scrounged sugar, sweet potatoes, onions, salt, and cucumbers from the nip cookhouse of a nighttime when the Japs were asleep. Fortunately, I was never caught. These would be sold to other racketeers, thus enabling me to look after my sick mate and myself. Most racketeers in business gave a donation of their profits weekly to the hospital. 27. Camp Commandant. Lieutenant Nito was in charge of this camp and was nearly always drunk on Burmese brandy. When he was drunk, you were not safe. He would walk into the camp area day and night looking for trouble. Things got so bad that Major Fisher, in charge of the hospital, said he would not be responsible for the lives of the men if they visited the latrines during the night, as Nito would think they were attempting to escape and have you shot. We were therefore ordered to use the gutters around our hut, and they were cleaned in the morning. Also, cholera was claiming many lives up the line. The first signs of cholera are frequently visiting the latrine. So we are warned in the dysentery ward not to give into the correct number of motions daily if asked, because Nito had a cholera complex and would not hesitate to have a man shot if he knew the correct number. With dysentery and diarrhea, it is not common for a man to visit the latrines 20 to 30 times daily. Many natives were shot as suspects of having cholera when they didn't have it at all. A sergeant for the hospital staff was shot by Nito at this camp on his way back from the latrines one night. Fortunately, he did not die as the bullet went into his shoulder. The following morning, Nito was sober and cried like a child, asking for forgiveness and offering his blood. He threatened to shoot our officers if this shooting episode was reported to Colonel Nagatama. Needless to say, it was reported, and Nito was taken away in disgrace. A Christian Korean guard by the name of Ariushi was very good to us in this camp. He worked in the Jap orderly room and brought fruit and eggs for sick men from the Jap's private supply, and also stole Jap medical supplies from the Jap hospital for our doctors. I did not hear of any instance of anyone being bashed by this guard. He attended our church services and burials until finally stopped by Lieutenant Nito. Lieutenant Yamuta, who we had in charge of us at Saigon, French Indochina with Ariushi, would have been the only two Japs that would have had their lives spared had the opportunity arisen to do away with the Nips. I could tell of many more incidents of the brutality of this Lieutenant Nito. 28. Dispersal area. For many days, American planes flew over our camp to bomb Thanbyzuat. Our first warning of aircraft was the panicking of the Nips. Our nerves were in a pretty bad state, but the Japs always led the rush to a dispersal area. We were given the liberty of about half a mile either side of the camp during the hours of daylight. 29. Business. As my health improved, I decided to enter business along with dozens of racketeers. One good thing about these rackets was the fact that money kept circulating in the camp, and almost everybody benefited by it in one way or another. Each man in business usually had sick friends who needed building up in health. I built up a capital by working for a rizal maker selling his rizals. I invested my money in Chandiga, and this brought me a profit of about 2 rupees a day. I also bought clothes and resold them to the natives. I would sneak down to their village during the hours of darkness. 30. Dutchmen. We Offies could never hit it off with the Dutchmen. They seemed to see life in a different way to us. At this camp, we were getting a fair amount of meat. The camp butchers, POW, did all the killing of the beasts. The lung, because of tuberculosis, was condemned by our doctors as being unfit to eat, so the cooks threw it away. The Dutchmen are the hungriest fellows I have ever met. They cooked and ate the lungs of the tuberculosis animals, and even cooked and ate the unborn calves. At 105-kilo camp, they even ate cooked dog. There was quite a lot of bitterness between the Aussies and Dutch here, as they killed and ate a pet dog belonging to the Aussies. The carcass of the dog was found in the jungle. The Dutch racketeers had the nerve to make dog sambal, chutney, and try to sell it to us at 5 cents a desert spoon. In Java, the Australians and Americans used to catch cats, kill and dress them, and sell them to the Dutchmen as alley rabbits for $2.30 each. Starving Burmese were paying us 50 cents each for rats, which were always plentiful. These Burmese coolies had less food than the POWs at times, although they did not work nearly as hard as we were. Many times the Japs would not pay them for a period of 2 months. One punishment inflicted on one of our lads at 30-kilo camp was standing on a chair at attention with eggs packed all around his feet. If the victim moved, the eggs would roll off, and he would be receiving a bashing for every egg which fell to the ground. August 15th, 1943 to February 27th. Ankanan. 1. Arrival. Left Kilo Camp for my first ride on the railway to the 83-kilo camp, which was as far as the line was laid at this time. Spent 2 nights at the 62-kilo camp and arrived per truck, and footed the 105-kilo camp on 17th August. The speed of the train was about 5 miles per hour, and the train would have to make several attempts before it could get over a small hill. 2. Camp. Best drained camp along the line. There were 5 huts and a hospital, all made of bamboo, and with atap palm roofs, which leaked very badly. As it was the rainy season, we had many uncomfortable nights' sleep. In case the reader is not aware of the seasons in Burma, there are 2, wet and dry. It rains between the months of March to October and is dry for the next 6 months. I have seen it rain incessantly for 6 days without a break. 3. Work. The pressure was put on again, and as much as 4 cubic meters of earth a day to be excavated was demanded by the Japs. Then the earth had to be carried and placed on the railway line. This was torture, and many men died as a result. The amount of work we POWs were doing in this camp was equal to, and probably exceeded, that which the hardest-working, well-fed Australian laborer was doing under good climatic conditions. Blitzing was at its worst here. Embankments were built approximately 60 inches above the ground, and many bridges spanned the creeks and rivers. When we first arrived in this camp, for about 3 months we had to build the road to enable transport to get through with food. Before this road was built, transport could not get through, and 200 men each day had to march through mud up to their knees on a rocky bottom, many without boots, to the 95-kilo camp, and bring back approximately 100-pound rice, salt and dried fish, each for the feeding of the POWs in camp. This distance covered was in the vicinity of 12.5 miles per day, which was very hard going over such ground. This road was made of corduroy. When the foundation of the line was laid, we worked in big stone quarries, breaking and carting metal to be laid on the foundation. The Japs would lay a charge of gelignite and block the rock, and we would break it up with big stone hammers and cart it through the jungle paths, where there would be men with small hammers who broke the stone down to the size necessary for the blasting of the line. The glare of the sun from this white stone was very bad, and this was very hard work in the quarries. A cubic meter of stone per man per day had to be broken, carted, and stacked before we could go back to camp. The railway line was laid, completed, and linked up with the Thailand side on October 2nd or 3rd, 1943. A colossal job. We were promised when the line was completed we would get plenty of good food and rest in the Thailand rest camp, but it was not until February that the majority of us got our spell. 3. Food. This was by far the worst camp along the line for food. We were 105 kilometers from the nearest town, and even when the line was laid, the Nips made no effort to increase our rations. On several occasions, we had only plain boiled rice and salt for a period of 4 weeks. Even when we were on better rations, we had only rice with chilies, turmeric, pepper and salt, and bamboo shoots boiled in water. This was called stew. 5. Water and rain. Before the rainy season broke, we had to cart water up a steep incline, a distance of a mile, twice a day for use in the kitchen. Then when the rainy season broke, there was more than enough water, and we often worked in the rain with mud and slush up to our knees. 6. Elephants. The elephants were also underfed and overworked, resulting in many of them dying. 7. Cholera. Cholera broke out in our camp and in many other camps. We did not know who was to be the next victim of this dreadful disease. It is the most painful of deaths. Men would go to work and suddenly develop terrific pains in the stomach. In a matter of 3 hours, they would be dead. Hundreds of natives died from this disease. Also, POWs. Owing to the shortage of men detailed for camp duties, which included grave digging for the POWs, many natives were left unburied and left to rot where they dropped. To give the reader some idea of the quickness of decay in this steamy jungle, I have seen an elephant rot with nothing but the bones left, 14 days after it had died. 8. Tropical ulcers. I saw some ghastly sights with tropical ulcers, and I went through much pain with them. Many of them were caused through having no boots. Ulcers 3 inches in diameter and equally as deep on the legs and feet, often right past the muscle and sinew of the legs, was a common sight. It was found with experimenting that to scrape the ulcer with a small aluminum spoon right down to the bone was the only way to help save the leg or foot, as the case may be. When gangrene set in, the leg had to be amputated. Not dozens, but hundreds of men died as a result of ulcers and amputations. Spinal injections were used to put the patient to sleep, but owing to the low condition and health of the men, dozens died after the operation. These amputations were done at the new hospital camp at the 55 kilo. It was not long before the cemeteries in all the camps along the line were filled with the bodies of POWs. The anesthetic was made from cocaine and Burmese brandy. 9. Wild animals. We saw many wild deer and wild boars in this area. During the night, the chattering of monkeys and roaring of tigers would be heard. 10. Jap headquarters. Japanese headquarters shifted to the camp in January from the vicinity of Thanbyzuat. Colonel Ishii, who took over from Colonel Nagatama, who was transferred to Singapore, was then in command of all POWs in the Burma area. 11. Christmas. We spent our second POW Christmas here, but it was far from bright. We got a pig between 1,000 men, given to us as a present from the Nips. After Christmas, we were informed we had to pay for the pig, $200, which was taken out of our monthly pay. 12. Film. The Nips took another film in this camp of men going out to work. The men were forced to sing and were expected to look happy as they passed the camera. The Japs ordered the men to sing Tipperary, but instead we had our own way and sang our version of Bless 'Em All, and we most certainly did not look happy. I often wondered what the Japs said when the record was played and the true meaning of the song was made known to them. 13. Putting it over the guards. Mess orderlies would be detailed to go back to camp for the midday meal and also to bring the guards dinner back. The Japs would have their stews in individual dixies. Their stews contained meat and vegetables, which we never had. Many times on the way back to the job, the mess orderlies would leave the jungle track, eat half the Japs' delicious stew, and top the dixie up again with water and urine. The Japs did not wake up to the practice. 14. Punishments. Here are just a few punishments inflicted on the men in the camp. 1. One day 60 of us were out in the jungle chopping wood for fuel for the railway engines. When the time came to knock off, a count of the tools took place and one shovel was found to be missing. Every one of us received a bashing for the loss of the shovel and were sent back in the jungle to find it, resulting in getting back to camp at 8 p.m. to cold boil the rice and stew. 2. A dog killed and ate one of the Japs' ducks. Fortunately, the Japs saw the dog attack the duck, which saved the blame from the men being attached to any of our men. However, the poor dog suffered as follows. It was tied up for 24 hours with a bowl of water just out of reach, as an example to us of what would happen if we were caught taking any ducks. The Japs, knowing what we were like as scroungers, got over the difficulty of any of their ducks going off by detailing a man who was responsible for the care of the ducks. 3. An American and 2 Aussies were caught thieving clothes from a Jap quartermaster store. A punishment of 72 hours of no food or water, standing to attention in front of the Jap guardhouse, was inflicted on them. One Aussie had a very bad ulcer on his leg, which swelled up to twice its size. He lasted about 30 hours and then collapsed. The other Aussie developed malaria and collapsed after 48 hours. The Japs thought he was shaming and kicked him like a dog. Tiring of this, they put ants on his body, but he was well and truly out of it. He was admitted to hospital. The Yank did his 74 hours and walked off with a forced grin. He could take it. Water would be placed in front of these men, but they were forbidden to drink it. At periods of the day, these men would request permission to go to the latrine, which were approximately 100 yards from the guardhouse. We always made a point of someone being there to give them a drink of water, unbeknown to the Japs. There was a dozen more examples of such punishments in our camp, and dozens of other camps. The treatment in these camps depended upon the type of Jap officer in charge. Unfortunately, we had a lousy Jap officer all the time we were in Burma. 15. Frontline soldiers. As soon as the line was completed, thousands of Jap soldiers, equipment and horses went west daily on their way to Rangoon and the Burma-Indian border. Equipment and horses went west daily on their way to Rangoon and the Burma-India border. We have been informed since we were rescued that this line has been blown sky high and is irreparable, cutting off the Jap retreat from Burma to Thailand. It is interesting to note the Jap soldier and engineers hated the Korean guards and many fights occurred between them. 16. Jap racketeers. Lieutenant Hosky, the Jap lieutenant in charge of our camp, was a wrestler in civilian life, and at this camp demanded a Batman from our ranks. The man detailed had to message this Jap daily, made his coffee for him, and keep his hut clean. When Lieutenant Hosky was going to take a trip to Moulmein, he would send this POW, Batman, around the camp to buy up all the watches he could from the POWs and would sell them to other Jap officers in Moulmein for 3 times as much as he gave for them. He would also bring back from Moulmein thousands of cigars and hoard them until we had no smokes and were craving for one. Then he would sell the cigars to the canteen, making about 300% profit. 17. Departure of sick. On Christmas Day, the worst cases of the sick were evacuated to Tamakan by train to a rest camp. This camp was in Thailand. They were packed in like sardines in kettle trucks for the 2-day journey. This evacuation took many days, as, at this period, there were 3,000 men in Ankanan. 18. Japan Party. A list of our civilian occupations was taken, and we were informed we would go to Thailand for a month's rest and then we would leave for Japan. I put myself down as a storekeeper, as I thought I might get a job where I could scrounge some food. Only the fittest were supposed to be detailed for Japan, but anyone who had 2 legs and 2 arms and could walk were classified as fit. 19. Departure. On February 27, we left by train for Tamakan, Thailand. Once again, we were packed like sardines in cattle trucks. There were still a few left behind in the jungle, but these all left in March for Thailand. We heaved a sigh of relief when we left the jungle behind with all the diseases and hard at work, and we thought for the many comrades that sweated on this railway line only to be buried in the heart of the Burmese jungle. February 29th to March 27th, 1944. Tamakan. 1. Arrival. We arrived at Tamakan on 29 February 1944, hungry and tired. After being searched, we were fed like fighting cocks, plenty of rice, a good thick meat and vegetable stew, and 2 extras comprising jam tart and a shortbread biscuit. The jam was made from a berry called tamarin, with yellow sugar, and the remainder of the tart and shortbread biscuit were made from millet flour. 2. Food. The food in this camp was really good, and next to Saigon was the best camp I was ever in. Plenty of meat, vegetables, eggs, and bananas were a part of the Jap issue. Also, canteen profits were spent on buying extra food to the kitchen and hospital patients. The canteens were operated by our own POW, incidentally. The doctors and hospital orderlies were all POWs, and the only time we saw Jap doctors was when we received injections for cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever, and bubonic plague. 3. Camp. The camp was one of the best laid our POW camps we had been in. The huts were bamboo, with palm leaf roof. A river, about 100 yards wide and very swift and deep, ran alongside the boundary of the camp. It was spanned by a large bridge, which was brought from Java in pieces. It was a particularly hot camp, and although the food was good, men were hit harder here with malaria than anywhere previously. We soon broke out in boils, scabies, and abscesses, due to the richness of the food and our blood clearing. 4. Work. It was a huge camp, containing all the remnants of the POWs who had worked in Burma, also a number of POWs who had been working in Thailand. Light work was done here, such as construction of huts, building of Jap headquarters, uploading of barges, which brought our food to the camp, and the hill party, which was carting Jap rations up a steep hill about 2 miles from the camp. This was an Akak post. 5. Punishments. 4 English officers were found in possession of a wireless set and received a bashing. The bashing was so severe that 2 of them died, and 1 was admitted to hospital with 2 broken arms. 6. Concerts. Concerts were again held regularly, and some excellent shows were put on under the management of Norman Carter, an Aussie civilian, captured in Java and given an honorary rank of lieutenant in the Australian Army. He was ably assisted by Captain Bronte Edwards of the 2/3 Machine Gun Battalion. Snow White, Wizard of Oz, and the 40 Thieves were some of the shows and would have been well received in any Tivoli theater in Australia. I took no part in these shows, as I had a good rest. 7. Amputations. Men were still having their legs amputated from tropical ulcers, and the cheerful way men with 1 leg would hop around on bamboo crutches was good to see. One concert night, 12 men with only 1 leg sang songs as Waltzing Matilda, Home Sweet Home, and Roll Out the Barrel. These shows helped to relieve the monotony of prison life. 8. Burial. Men were still dying daily. They had been brought out of the jungle too late. The first man that was buried in his blanket. The following day, his body was found lying on top of the grave with no covering. The Burmese natives had seen him buried and dug him up to steal his blanket. 9. Tropical ulcers. An item of interest I forgot to mention in the last chapter was that many ulcers became fly-blown due to the lack of clean bandages. In bad ulcer cases, these maggots were left in the ulcer for several days, as they ate the bad part of the wasted flesh. 10. Swimming. We were allowed to swim in the river for half an hour daily. The river was just out of the camp, and we would be escorted by Japanese guards. 11. Humor. All parties going outside the camp have to have one of our officers, plus Jap guard, with them. On passing the guardhouse, the officer was supposed to give the command, "Eyes right," in Japanese, "Kashara migi," and we had to turn our head and eyes to the right. On a swim parade one day, an American officer, instead of giving the command, "Eyes right," said, "Say, take a look at those guys," and after he had passed the guardhouse, he said, "Okay, boys, we've seen enough of them." Fortunately, the Jap didn't understand him. 12. Canteen. One could buy yellow sugar, bananas, eggs, pawpaws, fried and boiled eggs, cups of coffee with sugar. Occasionally, there were tins of milk and fish from the canteen, and the sale of watches, rings, fountain pens, and any other articles would be sold to the natives for cash. I had none of these things left, as I had sold mine many months previously. We were still being paid 25 cents a day if we worked. 13. Pickets. Right through the jungle and until we left Singapore, the second time, we had to supply 2 men from each hut to act as night watchmen or pickets. Each man did a shift of an hour per night. They were held responsible to see no one escaped, and we were threatened with death if anyone did so whilst on duty. A Jap guard would roam the camp area and check up on the pickets at various intervals during the night. The pickets would have to spring to attention and say the following: "Fushimbun, hut number 7, Niharku Sangu Young Ija Arimasan," meaning, "I am the picket, hut number 7. 234 men. I have no trouble. 14. Allied bombers. Night after night, we would hear Allied planes fly over our camp on their way to bomb enemy objectives. The Japs were without searchlights here, and one could not see the planes, yet they would open up with their ack-ack guns when they thought the planes might be overhead. Falling shrapnel from these guns would often fall in the camp area. Luckily, no one was ever hurt. We had instructions on the sound of an air raid alarm that every man had to remain in his hut under cover. 15. Number 3 and Number 4 camp combined, Thailand. It will be of interest to many parents and relatives. This camp is Number 3 and Number 4 branch POW camp, Thailand. There are approximately 6,000 POWs in this camp. It is approximately 60 miles north of Bangkok and is the second best camp I saw and lived in as regards to food, treatment, work, sport, etc. Also, letters from home have been received by the POWs regularly since the beginning of 1944. We were led to believe this was to be the permanent camp for the remaining POWs we left behind here. The only thing I had against this camp was the fact that it was frightfully hot. There were not nearly so many bashings in this camp as we had in Burma, owing, I think, to the change in the war situation. 16. Japan Party. We were sorted out here into kumis. In this case, there were 100 men, an officer, and a hospital orderly to each kumi. All told, detailed for Japan, were 8 kumis. I was the first batch to leave. 17. Clothing issue. Just before we left, we were issued with new boots, shirts, shorts, singlet, colored underpants, socks, and a green hat. My boots would not fit, so I sold them to one of the racketeers. 18. Search. I had anticipated a pretty thorough search of all our belongings and had therefore taken the precaution of not being caught with my 2 diaries, which I had kept daily since I boarded the Queen Mary to leave Australia in February 1942. I left them in Tamakan with a friend who had only one leg and was certain he wouldn't go to Japan. If he is unfortunate enough to die, I have left instructions for another fellow to bring them home for me. 19. Departure. Finally, the day of departure came, and on the 27th, March 1944, the first of 2 kumis left presumably for Japan, 300 men. The remainder followed 2 kumis daily. March 27th, 1944 to 24th June, 1944. Saigon. 1. Trip. We marched about 5 miles to Chonburi, railway siding, and after waiting for about 3 hours in the sun, we were herded like cattle into iron cattle trucks to make our trip of 37 kilometers to non-product, arriving about 5 p.m. We marched to the camp about 1.5 miles to the number 1 branch POW camp, Thailand. 2. Glamour boys. The POWs in this camp were drinking the water straight from the wells as they were away from the dangerous cholera zone. Our guards were not taking any chances with our health, as they were held responsible for us to get to Japan in good health, and all the water we drank had to be boiled. Thus, we got the title of Glamour Boys. We also had a slide taken here to be sure we carried no dysentery germs with us to Japan. 3. Reunion. It was whilst we were here that we met the remainder of the men from my unit, whom we had not seen since leaving Singapore in 1942. Also, many friends from many other units. It was a very large camp and very well laid out. They had been doing the same type of work as us on the railway line in Thailand, but since completion of the line, they also noticed a marked difference in conditions generally. This, I believe, is also meant to be a permanent camp for the POWs that are quartered there. They had a pretty tough time whilst the line was under construction, and we were told many gruesome talks of death and treatment under the nips. We also received an official list of men from my unit who had died. 4. Other forces. We were informed by men from this camp that since we left Singapore, the forces up to H, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, had been formed and left Singapore. F and H. Force had gone to Thailand. The other forces had left for Borneo, Philippines, Formosa, Japan, and Java, with a large number remaining in Singapore. 5. 600 Bridge. 600 POWs lost their lives from this camp in the construction of a railway bridge in Thailand, many men having been blitzed to work with malaria and other such complaints. On the Thailand side, officers were forced to work with the men, and many lost their lives on this bridge. 6. Nightmare March. When F and H force arrived in Thailand, they were forced to march from this camp through the jungle for a distance of 100 miles to where they began work on the line. This march took place in the wet season through rain, mud and slush, and hundreds of men lost their lives as a result. Several thousand Englishmen also took part in this march. 7. Food. The food in this camp was similar to that which we had in Tamakan and was very good. 8. Departure. We left by train at 3 a.m. on the 1st of April, 1944. Our destination, Saigon in French Indochina. We arrived at Bangkok Station, capital of Thailand, at 11 a.m. on the day we departed. There we changed trains and traveled on the Phnom Penh in Indochina, arriving on 3rd April. This was another monotonous train journey, similar to those we had in the past. Train trips with the Japs was a thing we dreaded, packed like sardines with very little food and sleep. 9. Town. Phnom Penh is quite a decent-sized town, being the capital of the province of Cambodia, a very rich province. It is situated on a huge lake which had much shipping on it. Here we saw the French people. They were not interned as we had expected, as they were supposed to be Vichy French, but many of the V for victory sign and thumbs up signs were given to us. We slept the night in an open paddock on the ground with no covering. Next morning, we boarded the Long Ho ferry and traveled along the largest river I have ever seen. It was sometimes 2 miles wide, fresh water all the way to Saigon. We arrived there at midnight on the 5th April, 1944. 10. Escape. In one of the Kumis, to follow up later, a Dutchman escaped at Phnom Penh, and as far as we know, was never caught. Many Dutchmen could speak French fluently, and was presumed he was taken care of by the French people. 11. Saigon Camp. The camp we marched to in Saigon was only a few hundred yards from the docks. The huts were built of wood, with a tiled roof, or some had atap palm roofs. Electric light was on, and some huts even had cement floors. There was a number of large cement reservoirs built in the camp for washing purposes. Some of the huts had 3 decks to sleep on, one built above the other. It was very hot at night, as we were packed so close. Our bodies were touching, and we could not sleep for breathing in one's face. This still was a good camp regarding food, work, which was the most important thing for us. 12. Food. The food was really excellent here. For breakfast, we would have 2 pints of rice and 1 spoonful of sugar. The rice was of excellent quality. Rice and a watery stew for lunch, and a really good thick stew, often containing eggs, and practically always meat and vegetables for dinner. About twice a week, we would get a boiled egg issued to us. 13. Englishmen. We met Englishmen who had left Singapore in April 1942, and they had suffered very little illnesses or deaths and were in really good condition. 1,000 of these had left Singapore in April 1942, but 700 of them had gone to Thailand on construction of the railway line, and we met the remaining 300. 14. Work. We worked at many places in Saigon, loading and unloading ships at the docks, building blast walls around petrol and ammunition dumps, excavating earth for underground petrol tanks, loading stores from the Jap Ordnance Depot onto railway trucks, also building a large wall of mud to keep back the tide, to reclaim ground for the erection of large brick storage buildings, carting 240-pound bags of rice on our backs to the ships from the wharf was the hardest job we had. One job the Japs made us do, which made us very bitter, was loading a hospital ship marked with a Red Cross sign with guns and war equipment. Note, there were no sick or wounded on the ship, and the Allies wouldn't bomb it. Rakayo Maru was the name of the ship. A large French passenger liner, used for transporting rice to Malaya and Singapore, was sunk just out from Saigon by Allied submarines whilst we were in Saigon. 15. Canteen. A very good canteen was in operation here, and prices for extra luxuries were very cheap. Such commodities as pineapple, pawpaw, coconuts, bananas, eggs, biscuits, cups of tea, cigarettes, and tobacco could be purchased. It did not take us long to find a good cash market for the new clothes we had been issued with Tamakan. As much as 20 piasters were paid by the natives for short and coats. They were feeling the pinch on clothing shortage. Money seemed much more plentiful in French Indochina than any other place we had been. 16. News. We were all well abreast with world news here. French and friendly natives would slip us newspapers and notes containing news items regularly. The newspapers were printed in French, and we would smuggle them into camp in our clothing and get them interpreted by men who could speak and read French. It was here we learnt of the invasion of France, and that bucked up us considerably. We were all certain that the European war would be finished within 3 months, and we did not give the Japs more than 6 months at the outside. 17. American officer. An American officer escaping the clutches of the Japs in the Philippines arrived in a small boat on the coast of Indochina, where he was handed over to the Japs by pro-Japanese natives. This officer went through the wire, which was well patrolled and night after night would bring back medical supplies, clothing, and food given to him by the French. We also managed to get 2 sets of boxing gloves. 18. Gifts of instruments and medical supplies. Lieutenant Yamata was in charge of us, and he did his best to better our already good condition. He allowed the French Red Cross to send us a piano, 2 violins, 6 harmonicas, 2 banjos, a saxophone, clothing for the concerts, and medical supplies. Concerts were held regularly here, and a good swing band under the leadership of a former American jazz band leader named J.B. Coles was started. I took part in several of these shows. 19. Dental extractions. There was no cocaine for dental extractions, and teeth were pulled with nothing to deaden the pain. I have seen stubborn teeth take half an hour to pull. We had no dentist. The doctor filled the bill. I had 2 teeth extracted, and do not want any more pulled without cocaine. 20. Bombing. On day 5, the air raid alarm sounded about 11 p.m., and 4 Allied planes dropped their eggs, the nearest of which fell only 70 yards from the camp. Next morning, we saw a brick tobacco factory laid flat only 100 yards from the Naval Ordnance Depot, containing high explosives. Many native huts were burnt to the ground. Plenty of ack-ack was sent up, but no planes were hit. We were very jittery, expecting more raids to follow, as we were only a few hundred yards from the docks. 21. Scrounging. Much scrounging went on at the docks. One night some bully beef was found to be missing, and a search was organized. One POW had a 7-pound tin and 2 by 12-ounce tins. We stood in the center rank and stood on the 7-pound tin, and as the Japs came along to search him, he held his hands in the air. A tin of bully in each, and actually got away with it. To get back to camp without the guards catching him with the bully, we placed them in the center of a heap of wood, which he took back to camp with him. I scrounged a 1-pound tin of cocoa, the first I had tasted for over 2 years. 22. Short time trip. On the 7th April, we left by barge to board the ship 30 miles away to take us to Japan. I was seasick for the first time in my life on this barge. At midnight, we boarded the vessel and bedded down on deck for the remainder of the night. There were many small ships in the convoy, and 1 kumi of 152 men were put in 2 ships. Only 2 kumis left time. This was the only Jap ship on which we had plenty of room. We were all on deck instead of the hold. About 3 p.m. the following day, instructions were wirelessed out to bring us back to Saigon, the excuse being there were too many ships in the convoy and too many stops en route for Japan, and too open to Allied bombing. This was the first and only time that our lives were worth anything to the Japs, and we took the yard with a pinch of salt. Half an hour before the convoy sailed, the barges pulled alongside and took us back to Saigon. I managed to scrounge 2 watermelons and a pomelo from the guards' private supplies. They tasted excellent. 23. Second attempt. About a month later on Kumi, was notified that they would be leaving for Japan on the following day. The Jap major in charge of the POWs in Saigon read a flowery speech the morning they were to leave. All the men had their kits packed, ready to move off. The major was in the middle of his speech when a telegram arrived saying the trip was canceled. His speech was very humorous. He said the Japanese people were awaiting with open arms to welcome the Australians who had helped in the construction of the Great Burma, Thailand Railway line. He said it would be springtime in Japan, with the birds twittering in the trees, and the clean, pure air would purify our unclean souls. We should feel honored and thankful to the Japanese government for being able to see this great country of Japan. Many POW were working cheerfully in Japan, and they had leave once a week to visit the different great cities they were camped in. When we arrive, we must work hard, and we would be well fed. If we did not work, we would not eat, as eating and not working is a sin in the eyes of our God. This we thought was quite funny, and imagine his embarrassment in the middle of his farewell speech when this telegram arrived. 24. Departure. On 24th June, and on consecutive days, all POWs left for Singapore from where we were informed we would leave for Japan. 25 trip. We traveled by ferry to Phnom Penh, spending 2 days there. Then came the long, monotonous journey to Singapore via Bangkok in closed cattle trucks. We received only 2 meals a day, and when we crossed the Thailand border in Malaya, we were informed of the fact of the acute shortage of rice in Malaya and Singapore. I learnt later the Thailand government refused to send any more rice to Malaya and Singapore. There we had been getting 2 pints of rice per meal. Now we received only a loose-packed pannikin of rice for 2 meals. The trip to Singapore was uneventful, except we had practically no sleep. We noticed on the railway stations many natives begging for food. These people were in a pitiful condition, and even though we only had a pint of rice per meal twice a day, we couldn't help but to give these poor beggars some of our issue. The Jap guards sold several bags of our dry rice, which was part of our rations, to some natives for a colossal figure. Cigarettes in Saigon were 30 cents for 20. In Singapore, they were 50 cents, or 1/6D each. We noticed in Bangkok that relations were very much strained between the Thai and the Japs. July 5th, 1944 to September 6, 1944. 1. Arrival. We arrived at Singapore railway stations about 2 a.m. on July 5th and marched to River Valley Road Camp about 3 miles from the station. The quietness of Singapore was particularly noticeable since we were last there. In pre-war days, Singapore was alive with activity 24 hours a day. 2. Camp. The River Valley Road Camp was directly behind the Great World Cabaret. It was built by the British for native evacuees left homeless from Malaya and was by now in a very bad state of repair. These huts were wooden structures with a very leaky atap palm roof, and one hut containing English POWs collapsed in the middle of the night a few weeks after our arrival, badly injuring a number of men. Some men had their arms and legs broken in this accident. The following morning, the Japs inspected all the remaining huts, but stated they were perfectly safe. We were very jittery because when a strong wind blew, they shook and swayed violently. 3. Inmates. The camp comprised of Englishmen, Dutchmen, Australian, and American Indians, about 6,000 men altogether. All these men, except the Indian POWs, were booked for Japan. There were only a few hundred Indians. 4. Java Boys. Over the river, there was another POW camp containing Aussies from the Middle East, captured in Java. They had been brought from Java a few weeks prior to our arrival in Singapore, and had been bombed and sunk along with several other ships. I could not find out how many lives were lost through this bombing, as we were forbidden to go to their camp. Whilst we were in the camp, they were taken to Sumatra to build the railway line. They were taken across in landing barges, as I think the Nips weren't taking a chance of a decent-sized ship getting bombed if there was another raid. 5. The Indian POWs. The Indian POWs in the camp were a few of the number that refused to join the Jap Army or Indian National Army and had undergone much torture at the hands of the Japs. Many of these Indians sneaked out of camp into Singapore during the night and brought back Japanese edited newspapers, but by reading between the lines, we had a fair idea of the war situations, although 100% of us thought for certainty that the war would be finished in a few months. 6. Food. We were on a very light rations here, only a loosely packed pint pannikin of rice 3 times daily. When we first arrived, we received an oil rations issue and dried fish, but this was shortly cut out. Green bananas, chilies, and tapioca roots made up our stew to go with the rice. We were always terribly hungry in this camp, and it was the worst camp we had been in. 7. Prices of food. Living conditions were high in Singapore. Here are a few of the prices of different food commodities on sale. I will give the prices in Australian currency. Small dressed duck, $30 each. Cigarettes, 1/6 of $1 each. Eggs, $5 each. Small cup coffee, no milk, 1/3 of $1 per cup. Bananas, 1/6 of $1. Coconuts, 2/6 of $1. The latter two should have been cheap, as they were plentiful. 8. Eurasians. The Eurasian civilian population found it hard to find work in Singapore, as the Japs would not trust them, as they knew they were very much pro-British. These people, on the smallest of excuses, were given 15 years to life prison sentences. An instance of this was the trivial offense of being in possession of wireless sets. The Jap MPs were trained on Gestapo lines. Most of the Eurasians left Singapore for Malaya, where they all congregated together and grew their own vegetables. Before we left Singapore, the remaining Eurasians and non-permanent residents of Singapore were ordered off the island of Singapore to Malaya, owing to the food shortage. 9. Jap headquarters. The Jap HQ shifted to Taiping, north of Ipoh, Malaya, whilst we were in Singapore. We were told by Chinese civilians that many hundreds of Japs were leaving Singapore by train daily, presumably for China. We noticed many army camps deserted before we left. 10. Sickness. I contracted my 20th bout of malaria and also had yellow jaundice while in Singapore and lost much weight. 11. Torture. Captain Bill Regan from an Australian oil tanker, taken POW in February 1944, and arriving in Singapore about June 1944, told of his experience. His ship was torpedoed and sunk by a Jap submarine in February. He and the crew took to the lifeboats and rafts. The Jap submarine surfaced, took Captain Regan on board, and machine-gunned his crew. 5 more Allied ships were sunk before the submarine returned to its base at Penang of the Malaya west coast. He lived on good British canned foods on the submarine. On arrival at Penang, he was placed in a cell in solitary confinement for several months. The Japs put red-hot needles under his fingernails and pumped water into him until his stomach swelled to twice its normal size, and starved him, trying to gain information about Allied shipping. He said the submarine he was on was a very modern type, carrying an aeroplane. He was blindfolded and brought to Singapore and Changi, POW camp, about June. 12. Group Captain and Colonel. A British Group Captain, Air Force, and an American Colonel, Air Force, were taken POW when their planes crashed in Burma. The English captain was flying fighter solo and had engine trouble and was forced down north of Rangoon. I do not know how the American colonel was brought down, except it was also in Burma. They were taken POW approximately November 1943 and did 5 months solitary confinement and tortured in a similar way to Captain Bill Regan. 13. Conditions of natives. The natives in Singapore were in an even worse plight than we were. All rice was under Jap control rationing system, and only 8.5 caddies, each caddy weighing 1.5 pounds, was allowed for each civilian once a month. The elderly native, too old to work and had no money, just simply died. Chinese were dying at the rate of 200 per day in the Chinese quarter of Singapore through starvation. One old Indian came to me and asked how long it would be before the British would return. I replied, within 3 months, I think. The poor beggar said he did not think he could last 3 months, as he had no money and was too old to work. He had eaten nothing but green leaves for the past week. 14. Black market. The black market was operated mainly by Indian truck drivers. They stole 240-pound bags of rice from the Jap storehouses and sold them at a terrific price to those who could pay for it. 15. Civilians. The civilians captured in Singapore in February 1948 were interned in the Changi civil jail, but we did not make personal contact with them and knew very little about their doings, apart from the fact that they were growing their own vegetables and they were not forced to work. We also heard from reliable Chinese sources that the European children were suffering from rickets and malnutrition owing to the absence of milk and unnecessary vitamins. 16. Work. We had been in Singapore more than 3 weeks when 50% of our forces were taken to an island about a half-mile from the west coast opposite Hurong Road to build a dry graving dock. Work had been in operation for about 12 months, and many hundreds of natives were working alongside the POWs. It was estimated it would take about 4 years to complete. Excavating earth was their job. Work was done in 2 shifts by the POWs. 7 p.m. to 2:30 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. The island they were camped on was nicknamed Jeep Island, after the nickname we gave to a Jap who was in charge of them. It was a small island, about 500 yards by 3/4 mile, and the men went to work in barges to the mainland, where the job was situated. Blitzing men out to work was in practice again, and the men worked hard on very poor rations. I was left on Singapore Island along with the remaining 50% of our force, and we worked in many places on Singapore Island, e.g., loading and unloading cargo ships at the docks, building blast wall and underground magazines for ammunition dumps at a rubber plantation called Buena Vista, unloading scrap iron from motor trucks and stacking it in large paddocks opposite the ABC brewery. This was the only brewery still in operation in Singapore, and it was controlled by the Japs. A Eurasian told me that the beer was very poor quality and very weak. A German submarine, very badly damaged, was laid up in the harbor. A German officer, who could speak fluent English, asked us how we were fed and treated by the Japs. On learning of a few facts, he expressed his sorrow and told us the Germans had no time for the Japs. He gave several of our men tins of bully beef and some bread and sausage sandwiches. One day when we were working on the docks, a car went past bearing a blue flag denoting that the car contained a Japanese captain or lieutenant. The officer, or NCC, in charge of the working party should have called the POWs to attention and salute the occupants of the car. This is the usual procedure. On this occasion, the POW sergeant in charge of the party of POWs failed to see the blue flag. The car pulled up, and the Japanese officer smacked our POW sergeant across the face for not calling us to attention and saluting. A German sailor from the submarine witnessed this bashing, and he wasted no time arriving on the scene and landing a beautiful punch on the chin of the Nip officer, knocking him to the ground. The Jap officer got up, stepped into his car, and left. We heard no more about the incident, but many a laugh we had at memories of this episode. Many men were caught scrounging from the docks, and many bashings occurred. Fine writing paper, used for cigarette paper, dried fish which smelt very strong, and occasionally cigarettes were about all that was worth scrounging. One English POW was caught getting through the window of a Jap store house in search of food and was given a bashing from 2 of the guards. He lost his head, and after being knocked to the ground and kicked in the stomach, he could bear it no longer. He got up and cracked the Jap guard across the mouth. Nothing was done about this until he returned to camp. Then he was given the bashing of his life by 6 Nip guards and made to stand to attention for 48 hours with neither food or water. 17. News. We heard many interesting World War news items whilst in Singapore from friendly Chinese and Eurasians. We learnt from a Eurasian in Singapore that Chinese with a few Australian guerrillas were causing the Japs plenty of trouble and worry on the mainland. These guerrillas were being fed by wealthy Chinese families who were 100% pro-British. The Chinese civilians in Singapore, whom we often came in contact with, hated the Japs for the treatment dished out to them, and even the poorest coolie and storekeepers were waiting and watching for an opportunity to rise and have a crack at the Japs. I think the Japs' rule in Singapore is very limited. 18. Departure. The men from Jeep Island returned to River Valley Road Camp on 3rd September, 1944, and Fort Kumis, 718 men were warned we would be leaving for Japan on the following day. The English were also warned of their departure on the following day. 599 men all told. The remainder of the camp would be following in 10 days. We marched to our ship, Rakayo Maru, a cargo ship of about 7,000 tons, and there were approximately 700 English POWs on the other ship, also about 7,000 tons. We sailed on the 6th September in a convoy of 9 cargo ships, on which 2 were oil tankers, with an escort of 6 destroyers and 2 light cruisers. We did not pick up some of these ships until 8th September. September 6th to September 20th, 1944. Torpedoed. 1. Ship life. We were herded like sheep and forced into one hold, 1,317 men in all. Many men fainted, and it was necessary for everybody to stand to enable the 1,317 men to get in. We stayed there for about 3 hours before our officers finally convinced the Japs that it was incapable to cram so many men in one hold, as men were fainting from the horrific heat. 300 men were then allowed on deck to sleep on top of the closed hatches. Many more drifted up during the day unknown to the Japs. I slept on the deck. For several days, we had only 2 meals of rice. It was changed to 3 meals about the 10th September. I, along with many others, scrounged some sugar from one of the cargo holds and ate it with my rice. On top of one hatch space, we made available for sick POWs. Owing to the shortage of fresh water, rice was cooked in salt water. The Japs could still bathe in fresh water. 2. Not optimistic. From news we had received in Singapore, we were told by the Chinese that one could almost walk to Japan from Saipan, Marianas, on the decks of American submarines. We had also heard of the wholesale sinkings in the China Sea. I was never so happy at the thought of leaving Singapore, even though we were starved and expected trouble from the time we left. Many men laughed at this pessimism and said half the news of these sinkings could be taken with a grain of salt. 3. Torpedoed. At 2 a.m. on the 6th September, we heard a terrific explosion and saw a light cruiser burst into flames and sink within 2 minutes of being torpedoed. The light cruiser was next to us on the starboard side. We were all ordered to lie down and sleep. At 5 a.m., we were awakened by another terrific explosion, and a sheet of water about 100 feet high crashed on the deck over us. Immediately followed by this was another similar explosion which shook the whole ship. We had been hit by 2 torpedoes, one tearing a hole about 10 feet wide in the bow, and the other scored a direct hit in the engine room. Depth charges were exploding in the water all around us. Within 10 minutes, there was not a Jap in sight, and all the lifeboats had been lowered and filled with Jap soldiers and civilians. Even the bridge was deserted. That was good enough for us. We sorted out life jackets, pulled up all the hatch covers, united all the rafts, and threw them overboard. Unfortunately, I didn't have a water bottle and had to leave the ship -1. I grabbed my hat and sweater, and with 2 mates, took to the water immediately following 2 long boards we had slashed together. The first thought was to get away from the ship, which might sink at any minute. I must say that the morale of the POWs was excellent. I did not see one instance of a man getting panicky, and all gave a hand to get the men out of the hold. Several, I do not know how many, were hit by fallen timbers from the blast when the torpedo struck. Captain Summer, 220th Battalion, had his false teeth smashed and his face badly bruised from the blast. I believe some of our fellows stayed on the ship till about midday. These men loaded water, food, and medical supplies in a boat which they claimed and set out for land, traveling westward for the China coast. I did not see Brigadier Varley, the group captain, or the British colonel, who were also aboard and have not even been able to find out how they fared. Whilst we were in the water, within half an hour, we saw 2 oil tankers blaze up in flames and sink. This lit the sea up for miles around. Then another cargo ship similar to ours, and a destroyer in the act of signaling, sank. Depth charges were exploding all around us, and we had a peculiar pinging in the pit of the stomach when we heard these go off. Dozens of men vomited, including me, for several hours after being in the water. I got cramps in my feet due to my exertion trying to leave the ship, but managed to make it to one of the many rafts floating about. If it wasn't for the efforts of David Flynn of Adelaide and Frank Jesse of St. Arnold of Victoria in helping me to a raft and massaging my legs and feet, I would not be here today. I am glad to say that both men survived the ordeal and are here in Australia today. About half an hour before the sun went down, we saw the Rakayo Maru nose lift right out of the water and sink. During the day, we had attempted to get back for water and food supplies. Many of us thought it was going to stay afloat as it was well out of the water until a few minutes before she went down. I think the cargo of rubber and hemp saved it from sinking immediately. The other cargo ship containing the 700 English POWs split in two and sank as soon as it was hit. 4. Adrift at sea. At first, half a dozen rafts were tied together, but this was found not a good idea, as towards the evening on the first day the sea became very choppy and the rafts continually banged together. This became dangerous of the risk of breaking a leg. 2 other rafts and our rafts decided to head westward for the China coast. We did not know until after we had been picked up that the nearest land was 300 miles distant. Floating in the water, we picked up several cases of salted fish, but it was too salty to eat, so we broke up the cases and made paddles out of them. There were 18 of us when we left the main body men, and 5 survived the ordeal. Although we made little or no headway paddling, I think it occupied our minds and helped us through. I had a hunch something would turn up. I was always optimistic. I had always visualized the reunion with my people at home in Australia and could not imagine being drowned at sea. It is definite that my hope stopped me from going insane, as was the case of the majority who drowned. The rafts were approximately 10 square feet, and after the first day, we decided to sit on them, as it was too much of a strain to hang onto the sides. With the weight of our bodies, the raft was at all times about 2 feet under the water, which meant the water was up to our chest. Men could not resist the temptation of drinking salt water, which after the second day looked and tasted like spring water. With the horrific heat of the sun and drinking salt water and exposure to the elements, it was not long before many men became delirious. I was frightfully sunburnt and lost a couple of layers of skin after our rescue. One POW killed the Jap in the water after taking his flask of sake, Japanese whiskey, drank it and drowned himself. I could not get the ghastly thought of sharks out of my mind. As we drifted away from the floating oil, I kept a sharp lookout for them. I have been told that several sharks followed some of the rafts for days. A Japanese who had tied himself to a raft had half his arm and neck bitten by a shark. On the second day, a Jap destroyer picked up all the remaining Japanese in the water, leaving us at the mercy of the sea. This Jap destroyer, weaving in and out among our rafts, was hailed by our lads, who asked what was to become of them. The Japs grinned derisively and with their thumbs pointed to the bottom of the ocean. The 2.5 years POW life, plus the horrors of the torpedoing, had not broken the ever-present spirit of the Aussies and Englishmen, who immediately began to sing Rule Britannica. I know of several Japanese being killed by some of our fellows prior to the destroyer arriving. The oil floating on the water was a menace covering our bodies and getting into our eyes, causing much pain. As men lost their reasoning, all sorts of visions were seen by them. They would leave the raft, saying they were going to the canteen for a drink, or that they were sick of this and going to that Red Cross ship over there. We pulled them back time and time again, but as we became weaker, we could do nothing for them. It was a painless death for the majority of the poor beggars. One man who was a Roman Catholic took off his life jacket and handed it to a man who didn't have one, took out his rosary beads, and jumped into the water after saying goodbye to all. It was bitterly cold at night and boiling hot during the day. In the afternoon of the third day, the sea became very rough and a typhoon sprang up. Men who were too weak to hold on simply floated off the rafts and drowned. On the fourth day, we were just about exhausted and as thirsty as the devil when I sighted a submarine on the horizon. I was frightened to mention it as I thought I was imagining it, but as it drew nearer, there was no doubt about it being a submarine. As it drew nearer, we saw men standing on the deck with machine guns pointing at us. We could see they were not Japs and thought they were Germans. Picture our surprise and joy on hearing them call out, "Take it easy, you guys, and we will soon have you aboard." I was wearing a pair of silk shorts. a short-sleeved shirt, which fell to pieces, and a green hat at the time of rescue. 5. Luck. We were told by the skipper of the submarine that they were cruising back through these waters in case any of the ships that were hit were still afloat. They were cruising just below the surface with the periscope showing when they sighted what they thought were Japanese still floating in the water. Rather than see them, even if they were the enemy, die a lingering death, he gave orders to his crew to come to the surface and go on deck with their machine guns and kill the unfortunates in the water. We were covered in oil, and thus the reason for thinking we were Japs. One of the crew noticed the fair hair of a West Australian lad and called out to the crew to hold their fire until they had made sure we were not Japs. This lad was brought aboard for questioning whilst we were held back at the point of the machine gun. No doubt the reader is wondering why we did not call out and tell them who we were, but our throats were so dry we could just get out a gurgle. The typhoon which had sprung up was so strong that the sub, normally capable of 23 knots, was cut down to 4 knots until the weather eased the following day. The depth of the ocean where we sunk was 1,375 fathoms. 5A. Life on the Pampanito. We were given water and hot soup in limited quantities. The oil was washed off our bodies, bathed and cleaned up by members of the crew. We were all in a state of collapse and were dressed in clean clothes and put to bed. It was an American submarine that picked us up, and I must say we were nursed and looked after from the time we came aboard until we left the sub, as well as our own mothers would have done. Members of the crew, after a 4-hour watch on deck and due for a rest, gave up their beds to us, cared for us and our wants, such as cocoa, soup, and water. For the first couple of days, we were not allowed to eat any solid food, but were given liquids, fruit juices, and vitamin tablets. The majority of us had festered sores and bad sunburn, which was treated by a very capable doctor who worked on us for 48 hours without sleep. One man died after arriving on board. There were 73 survivors picked up on our submarine. The Sea Lion, built in 1943, had 53 sinkings to her credit. The Pampanito had sunk an aircraft carrier 3 months previously as it was being launched in Tokyo Harbor after waiting for 30 days in the harbor. Altogether, there were 159 survivors picked up, 6 dying, and buried at sea. 1,158 were believed to have been drowned by our ship. We steamed full steam ahead for Saipan at 23 knots, arriving on 20th September to be greeted by movie cameras and flashlight photographers. We were given oranges, apples, and ice cream, our first for nearly 3 years. Oh boy, did they taste good. We were taken by ambulance to the General Hospital in Saipan. September 20th to October 10th, 1944. Saipan to Guadalcanal. 1. Arrival. We were astounded at the sights we saw in Saipan. Everything was so modern to us. Every soldier carried an automatic rifle. Jeeps were flying around here, there, and everywhere. Dozens and dozens of American war vessels were anchored in the harbor as far as the eye could see. It was our first sight of a Jeep, and we were rather amused at its toy-like appearance. These sights left us in a daze. At the General Hospital, we were well received and immediately had a bath and got into bed for a well-earned sleep. It had been rather crowded in the sub, and as I had rested in the engine room, had had very little sleep because of the terrific noise of the engines. Now I made up for lost time. I was completely dead for 3 days. 2. Food. Our special diet contained all the necessary vitamins to build us up and bring us back to normal. Our appetites sharpened and have been pretty sharp ever since. Every item of food we ate was a novelty, as it was 2 years, 7 months since we had tasted our own food. 3. British intelligence. The day after our arrival, a British naval officer arrived by plane from Honolulu and interviewed us. We were able to give him some very interesting and valuable information as to the exact location of Jap concentration camps, petrol and ammunition dumps, etc., etc. We also told him of our treatment under the Japs. 4. Rumors. Our old friend, the Furphy, did not take long to catch up with us bearing all sorts of rumors. Flying home via Honolulu was one tale. Home via America was another. 5. Hospital. Considering the short time the Americans had had possession of Saipan, life was running very smoothly, and the hospital was a well-organized unit with beds and wonderful spring mattresses. After having slept on bamboo floors for such a long period, it was quite odd sleeping on a soft bed between sheets. 6. Movies. An open-air picture theater was in operation nightly in the hospital area, and we saw many good shows. Lena Turner in Marriage is a Private Affair, Street of Chance, Corvette 225, Take It or Leave It, and several others. 7. Red Cross. The American Red Cross did everything in their power to make us as comfortable as possible, and we wanted for nothing. We were outfitted in American uniforms before we left Saipan. It was quite a change, shaving every day. 8. Dazed. For many weeks we were in a dazed state. Everything we saw was new to us. It was as though we had been reborn and every minute had new surprises in store. We were still up in the clouds and found it hard to realize it was not a dream. 9. Humor. I had many talks with Marines who took part in the actions of Saipan and heard many interesting and humorous things of their bloody battle. 2 stories worth recording are as follows. One Marine captured an English-speaking Japanese colonel and was taking his prize back to headquarters when the colonel said, "You have taken the Solomons, the Marshalls, Saipan, etc., but we still have New York." The Marine saw red and shot the colonel dead. So, you see what Jap propaganda is. The Japs believe anything told them. They are taught to hate the Americans and British and told not to be taken POW, as the Allies torture their prisoners. The other story was told by a corporal from the Marine Corps. He said, "In the height of the battle for Saipan, I came across a dead Jap with a bullet right between the eyes. A note was pinned on his shirt with the message, 'Don't bury this guy, because it'll be a long time before you will see such goddamn good shooting as this.'" There are still a few Japs in hiding in the many caves on Saipan Island, but the Marines are clearing these out. They have been given an opportunity of surrendering. Only a few have done so. The remainder believe in this torture story and prefer to starve to death. They are very cunning. One instance of their fatalism and cunning is as follows. A Jap came out of a cave with his hands in the air, as thought surrendering. In was a hand grenade with the pin out. Fortunately, this was seen by the Marines, who shot him before any harm was done by him. Japanese are commanded by their officers to commit hara-kiri suicide rather than be taken POW, which is a disgrace in their eyes. 10. Appreciation. Last but not least, I must tell you of the appreciation I left for the goodness of the American people we met on. Cigarettes, sweets, ice cream, and home comforts were showered upon us. I could never express in writing how much we appreciated all that was done for us. 11. Departure. On the morning of the 28th September, we bid our new friends farewell. We were taken by ambulance, loaded with cigarettes, etc., to the wharf where we boarded a motor barge and taken out to our new home on board an American troop transport ship of about 7,000 ton, called SS Alcoa Polaris 12. Arrival in hospital. We were welcomed on board by about 500 Marines, who were traveling to Guadalcanal, and were taken to our quarters. We slept on comfortable canvas, bottom bunks in the forward hatch. We were classed as passengers and semi-hospital patients. I was admitted to sickbay on arrival, as I had a small tropical ulcer on my leg, and many boils due to my blood clearing through eating rich food. And it was rich food. I'll say it was. Turkey and chicken were a regular meal on board. It was on the 2nd October, 1944, that I decided to write a few pages on my experience as a POW, but when I took up the pencil, I just wrote on and on, writing up until 4 a.m. every morning before I could sleep. My nerves were very highly strung, and I kept living over the past few weeks and visualizing my home coming to my loved ones, and just could not get to sleep. This writing helped to pass the dragging hours away. I was discharged from sickbay on 7th October and carried on with my story back in my quarters. 13. Jitters. Everybody was very jittery on board ship, and when the general alarm was sounded, we grabbed our life belts, and our faces paled before we realized it was just boat drill. We were warned one day that in 10 minutes, the gun crew would be having target practice. Nevertheless, we nearly jumped out of our skins when we first heard the explosion of shells being fired. 14. Movies. We saw many good shows on board. They were 7 Days Leave, Shadow of Doubt, Lucky Jordan, and Hudson's Bay. 15. Eniwetok Island. We arrived and anchored at Eniwetok on 3rd October, a very flat and barren island in the Marshall Group. We could see the tops had been knocked off all the coconut trees during the Battle of Eniwetok, as they are a popular hiding place for the Jap observation posts and snipers. Once again, the sea was black with American naval craft, giving us some ideas the colossal might of the American Navy. 16. Crossing the line. On 6 October, escorted by a destroyer, we left for Guadalcanal, a step near home. We crossed the equator at 1 p.m. on 8th October, and it was then that I witnessed one of the funniest scenes of my life. King Neptune came aboard to see the initiation of the Polywogs. Many sailors and Marines had not crossed the equator before. The shellbacks, or old-timers, got busy early in the morning, and not until 1:30 p.m. did they let up on the poor rookies. They armed themselves with flat pieces of board and bashed hell out of the rookies across the seat of their pants. Here are a few of the pranks that were played upon the Polywogs. Races around the deck riding straw brooms, hanging by one hand from steel ladders whilst they received a tanning across the seat of their trousers from the shellbacks, kissing the boots of the shellbacks, pushing matchboxes along the deck with their noses. No smoking was allowed by the Polywogs. All had notices written on cardboard and hung around their necks with such things as, "I am stupid," "bash hell out of me," etc., etc. One Polywog was ordered to stand on the hatch and call out to the captain on the bridge, "Captain of the ship, I command you to turn the ship around and head for San Francisco." At 1 p.m., when King Neptune came aboard, the real torture began. Each Polywog was blindfolded and brought up from below and was forced to do the following: kneel down on the deck for about 10 minutes before, confronting King Neptune, who was dressed in a long white flowing beard and gown with a trident in his hand. His wife, the queen, sat alongside him. She would fill a finger stall with fish oil. This had a small hole in the end and forced the unfortunate Polywog to place it in his mouth and close same. The queen would then pull the finger stall out, leaving the fish oil in the Polywog's mouth, which he was forced to swallow. He was then still blindfolded, led to several other fellows who would squirt all sorts of sour-tasting liquids in his mouth, and once again he was forced to swallow. Next on the program, he had his hair cut off and hacked about by several barbers. His blindfold was then taken off, and he was made to dive into a water tank about 3 feet deep and sprayed with a 4-foot powerful hose. He was then tarred all over his back. Lastly, he was made to run the gauntlet between about 30 men who smacked him across the seat with flat boards. His trousers were wet from his dunking and clung to his body. Needless to say, this bashing across the seat of the trousers gave him much pain. He was now initiated into the realm of King Neptune and could be classed as a shellback. He was presented with a proclamation declaring he had duly been initiated. It took many hours to get the tar off his body with the aid of petrol, soap, and hot water. 17. Singing. We had many good community singing hours on board ship, and a favorite the Americans loved hearing was Waltzing Matilda. 18. Arrival. We eventually sighted our destination, Guadalcanal, at 12:30 p.m. on 10th October, and were greeted on board by a captain from Intelligence Department, who gave us some interesting information as to our movements for the near future. We were told we would be leaving for Australia in 4 days on board an American naval vessel. Also, we were pleased to hear the people home in Aussie were eagerly awaiting the return of members of the 8th Division. We bid our friends on board farewell and boarded a barge which took us ashore about a mile distance. I forgot to mention we wrote an airmail letter in Saipan and Guadalcanal. October 10th, 1944 to October 14th, 1944. Guadalcanal. 1. Arrival. We arrived at the 20th Station Hospital about 2 p.m. and were billeted in mosquito-proof huts built of 3-ply wood. We slept on iron beds with a champion spring mattress. 2. Camp. The camp had an ideal location. It was built in between rows of coconut palms and was quite cool. The food was very good, and we ate in a large mess hall containing tables and forms. 3. Canteen. We received our first AIF pay of $10 on 12th October and immediately made for the canteen to purchase cigarettes to take home, as we had heard of the shortage at home, candies and boot polish, etc. It was a well-stocked canteen. American cigarettes were 200 for $3. 4. Red Cross. The American Red Cross were again very good to us here, giving us many home comforts, cigarettes, etc. We were also given our first bottle of beer. We received 2 by 12-ounce bottles each. The Red Cross organized a tour of the island. It was a very interesting drive, particularly were the aeroplanes which we were able to look through. We had afternoon tea at the Henderson Aerodrome, where many NZ Air Force boys were stationed. 5. Movies. We saw 2 good movies on the island, The Impatient Years and Peter Lorre and The Mask of Demetrios. 6. Surprise. On Friday 13th, a South Australian girl came to our ward looking for any 8th Australian who were amongst us. Imagine my surprise and joy at finding this girl, Dorothy Harvey, as she had lived only a few streets from my home in Adelaide and knew many of my old friends. She had many surprises for me in the shape of local gossip. I learned from her that girls who wore pigtails when I left had now married, and some had children. It made me feel quite an old man. We had quite a long and interesting chat together. 7. Departure. On Saturday morning, 14th October, we bid our good American friends adieu and were taken by barge to our new home on board, an American mine layer called the Monadnock. October 14th to 18th, 1944. Arrival in Australia. 1. Arrival. We boarded the Monadnock about 9:30 a.m., Saturday 14th, October, and were greeted by the American Navy men. We sailed at 11 a.m. 2. Ship. The ship was the cleanest on which I had yet traveled. The decks were all painted gray and were spotlessly clean. We were shown to our quarters on the mine deck, directly under the main deck, and were issued with canvas stretchers, sheets, and blankets. 3. Rough sea. About 10 a.m. on the second day, the sea became very rough and choppy. The ship, being empty of mines, bobbed around like a cork. About 1/3 of the crew, included most of our fellows, were seasick and missed a meal or two. It was not until about 8 a.m. on the third day that the sea settled down. 4. Nerves. I am afraid I had very little sleep on board, as my nerves were pretty well strung up, and I could not keep home out of my mind. 5. Americans. Once again we were treated with great kindness by the crew. I would like to mention here that from the time we were rescued from the perils of the sea, we have mixed and met with many Americans, sailors, soldiers, Marines, nurses, and doctors. I cannot speak highly enough of the wonderful way in which they treated us, and I feel sure that every survivor will always appreciate and remember our good American friends. 6. Arrival. We steamed up the Brisbane River with the never-to-be-forgotten sight of Australian soil on both sides. It was a perfect spring day, and I think we all had a lump in our throats as we gazed at the sights we passed. Eventually, we arrived at the wharf at 1 p.m. on 19th October to be greeted by the strains of such well-known music played by an army band. The Beer Barrel Polka, Waltzing Matilda, Colonel Bogey. Our arrival was evidently kept a secret, as there were no civilians to greet us, only army officials. General Blamey and General Stankey were among these. We were taken in army buses driven by AWAS to Stewart Home Convent, about 4 miles from Brisbane. 7. Camp. It was a marvelous camp built on top of a hill overlooking the city of Brisbane. We were put in bedrooms, 2 men in each room, and were well cared for by nurses from an Australian General Hospital. General Blamey, GOC Australian Army, visited us and gave us a very warm welcome. The Australian Red Cross gave us the world. There were tennis courts with new rackets and balls supplied, a movie every evening, Australian fruits, ice cream, cigarettes and beer, and anything else we cared for. We will never forget the kindness and gifts bestowed upon us by this wonderful organization and the kind and sympathetic way in which Australian nurses treated us. 8. Medical. We underwent a thorough medical examination, and it was found that about 95% of us had worms. The treatment to rid us of these was pretty terrible. Teeth extractions, fillings, and new dentures were also done here. 9. Interrogations. We were interrogated by intelligence departments of the 3 services regarding treatment by the Japs, names of personnel on the ship, names of personnel and particulars of the unfortunate men still in the Jap hands, plus information as to the whereabouts of Japanese ammunition, petrol dumps, and locations of POW camps in the various countries. It certainly was a pleasure to be of some assistance to the authorities regarding locations of dumps and POW camps, and particularly to be able to give some definite information of present POWs. 10. Pleasure. There was plenty of pleasure to be had in the form of organized trips to the various beaches and holiday resorts around Brisbane. No leave was granted to us for obvious reasons. 11. Laughs. We had many a laugh at all the girls we saw in uniform. Girls delivering mail, driving trams and buses, etc., was something very new to us when we left Australia in February 1941. The only girls in uniforms were nurses. 12. Surprise. We were very surprised to see Australia and the Australian people taking life so easily. It was very hard to believe there was a war on, but we knew differently. 13. Filming. Fox Newsreel took a movie of several of us whilst we were in Brisbane, and I was one of the nervous fellows who faced the camera and spoke into the microphone a few words on the humorous side of our POW days. 14. Letters. On October 20th, 1944, I received my first news from home since November 1942. I am not ashamed to admit I cried like a baby. I think we were all affected the same way. I had heard so many stories about the Yanks marrying our girls. I did not know just what to expect, but my fiancée, now my wife, waited for me. I was engaged in September 1939 and married on December 9th, 1944. 15. Departure. I bid my good friends in Brisbane goodbye on 31st October and flew to Sydney in a Douglas transport plane where we spent the night at the TMCA. We had all sorts of privileges, e.g., only 35 pounds of luggage is allowed on a plane. My kit bags were filled with gifts, cigarettes, etc., and weighed 95 pounds. Squadron leaders and Army officials were taken off the plane just before it left to make room for we lucky and privileged fellows. 16. Home. We left Sydney for Parafield, South Australia, via Melbourne, where we stayed for 30 minutes. We arrived at Parafield at 12 noon and were taken by an Army staff car to Wayville, from where we were given 62 days leave. Later we were given an extra 30 days, making a total of 92 days. With a lump in my throat, I was driven to my home at Heathpool Road, Heathpool, where I was met by my family and fiancé. I shall never, ever forget that reunion. The house was decorated with flags, flowers, and colored lights, a sight which will always live in my memory. There were 2 people missing. My brother, which I had not seen for nearly 5 years, was away in New Guinea, and my best cobber in civilian life was in Darwin, both doing their bit in the war effort. After being home only 3 days, I was again admitted to hospital for 2 weeks owing to a tropical ulcer breaking out on my leg. My wife has lodged a request for a discharge from the RANS, which services she has been a member for the last 2 years. We spent a week at Victor Harbor and a week at Mount Gambier for our honeymoon. Since then, I have been contacting as many parents of present and deceased POWs as I possibly can, as I know how worried they all are. At least I have been able to brighten many homes with good news of their boys, whom I have seen during the last 12 months or so. In closing, I sincerely hope this book has some effect on the easygoing people who have not yet realized there is a war to be won. Songs I used to sing in the POW camps of Singapore, Burma, Thailand, French Indochina. Words written by Frank L. Houston of Blackburn, Melbourne. Home for Christmas. To the tune, 11 more months and 10 more days. We joined the blinking army. They told us we'd have fun. They sent us to Malaya, and now look what they've done. We've been like this for over 2 years, but now it won't be long. And so all you no-hopers pay attention to my song. We'll be home in time for Christmas, so the boys around us say. So pack up all your troubles, 'cause we're leaving any day. There's men who came from Java, some men, some men from Singapore, some Navy and some Air Force. In fact, there's men galore. And Nippon here has told us, men go home when railways made. But now the writing is on the wall. We know their hopes will fade. The rumors fly like Cocky's chaff, each day a change of views. The Russians must be quite worn out to keep up with the news. We like to get the dinkum oil. We like to know it's right. Not that England's jumped down off the fence. She'll soon clean up this fight. The Singapore Retreat. Tune. The Man That Comes Around. There's the man that said Singapore shall not, must not fall. He pushed us in the scrum and he left us with the ball. We'll resist them on the land, repel them everywhere. But little did we realize his words were all hot air. Now on the peninsula, the pace man was rough and fast. Lots of us were wondering how long the thing would last. But we'd be going yet, we'll have you understand, though we knew we were finished when we ran out of land. The Air Force were magnificent. They longed to have a crack. They all set out one sunny day and both of them came back. The Navy did their very best to help us in the fray, but the only thing they didn't do was take us all away. And now we're POWs, which isn't very nice, 'cause we're fed on a diet of water stew and rice. Now there's a man that comes to our house. He brings around his gun. He gives a little grunt and expects us all to run. He creeps without a sound in his little sneaker boots. But things will soon be different for the dirty little coots. You have been listening to a true autobiography of my life as a prisoner of war from 15th February 1942 until 12 September 1944. Author, J.W. Turner. Narrated by Will Stoff.